Chapter 960. Around the lawn behind the official residence, dozens of Special Task Force agents holding black umbrellas vigilantly watched the surroundings. The entire street was under tight control. Beside a cedar tree, Director Breen, whose face was full of anxiety, looked at the two people on the lawn. Since he was not allowed to go forward, he could only nervously tell his subordinates to be more careful. President Pabray walked slowly on the snow-covered lawn. He wore a dark trench coat and held a black umbrella in his hand. The falling snowflakes silently landed on the umbrella and stuck to the front of his coat. Du Xiaoqing, who was silently following behind him, did not hold an umbrella. The general did not wear sunglasses today, and he wore black lambskin gloves on his hands. His dark military uniform was as straight as usual, without a single wrinkle. The snowflakes that fell on the uniform either fell or melted, dyeing it in different shades. He looked at the dark side of the president's face and suggested in a low voice that they return to the official residence. President Pabray shook his head and looked at the people on the other side of the lawn. He said, "Because of the appearance of those rebel soldiers, they are a little too nervous." Du Xiaoqing maintained his silence. To define those soldiers as rebels, in my opinion, it is a little ridiculous, even shameless. President Pabray stopped walking and looked out from under the black umbrella, but he did not know where he was looking. He smiled bitterly and said, "The official residence has received the report from the Ministry of Defense, and I believe you should have also seen the official accusation made by Colonel Li Feng. But it was not until last night when I saw the officer in the wheelchair that I dared to believe that everything that happened on the Mo Hua planet was true." He turned his head and looked at Du Xiaoqing quietly. He said, "Now it seems that you were right to advise me not to appoint Hu Lian as the enemy's commander-in-chief. The things that he and Director Bailey have done will make the Federation government pay a great price." President Pabray did not know about the purge on the front line of the new 17th Division and the murder of the first 7 groups of soldiers. Even after receiving the report, he was still unwilling to believe that the senior officials who were loyal to the government would do such a thing. Not only were they cold-blooded and ugly, they were also so stupid. President Pabray thought about the attack on the sanatorium in Spring City. He thought about the accusation made by the member of Group 7 at the meeting last night. He thought about the small-eyed man who had returned to the Federation and was hiding in the darkness. He let out a deep sigh with a strong sense of self-mockery. There were also the parents of the members of Group 7. Mr. President's expression became even colder. He had a vague feeling that some troublesome and even extremely dangerous factors were about to appear, and it was something that he could not control. The silent Du Xiaoqing finally opened his mouth to speak. He looked at Pabray and said, "Mr. President, if a lion leads a flock of docile and incompetent sheep to battle, although it is hard, it is not necessarily a failure. But if a lion leads a flock of greedy aardwolves to battle, perhaps it will collapse before defeating the enemy." President Pabray frowned slightly and fell into silence. "I still adhere to the views of that day. There are many people in the government and the military who are not worthy of trust and are not worthy of being relied on. Such people can only cause harm to our cause, and will not be of any help." Du Xiaoqing's face was cold and indifferent. He said firmly, "The people I am referring to include Chairman Li Jiedu. Lieutenant General Hu Lian is his student. He is the leader of the infamous Joint Investigation Group. You should keep your distance from him." President Pabray looked at him and said after a moment of silence, "Du Xiaoqing, if you are willing to take out the patients on the battlefield and look at the history of human society, you will probably understand that Chairman Li's willingness to sully himself is in fact a kind of sacrifice." He waved his hand to stop Du Xiaoqing from continuing to suggest. He said in a deep voice, "Those families, especially those in the back of Macho Mountain, have been silent for too long. Now they have the best opportunity. I believe that they will not continue to be silent. Your task now is to let the army make all the preparations. Of course, if the situation does not enter the most difficult and complicated situation, we will try not to let the army participate in these affairs. After saying this, the snow-covered lawn fell into silence again. After a long time, Du Shaoqing stood at attention and saluted, and then left in the snow. Walking into the official residence, President Pobre handed the dripping black umbrella to the staff, took off his windbreaker and put it in his arms, and pushed open the heavy antique wooden door of the dining room. After entering the door, the worry on his face disappeared without a trace. Looking at his busy wife, he laughed loudly and said, "Dear, what are we having for lunch today?" The First Lady of the Federation turned around and took the windbreaker from his arms. She replied with a gentle smile, "Green beans and minced meat. There is hot soup on the table. Have a sip to warm your body. It seems that the snow will continue to cool down. I am afraid that it will not warm up until March." The First Lady began to tidy up the table and prepare lunch. She put the bread basket in front of her husband, who was drinking soup. Then she turned on the TV and said casually, "Chairman Li has been coming to the official residence to eat much less recently. You also know that he is very busy these days." President Pobre lowered his head and drank the pepper soup. His tanned face showed a satisfied expression, and he praised exaggeratedly, "The soup still tastes so good. I feel hot all over after drinking 2 spoonfuls. Pretending that the food is delicious to please me. You have been using this trick since we were dating. Don't you find it annoying?" The First Lady said with a smile. "This trick of yours is not as good as Colonel Su Li's. Every time he comes to eat, he doesn't need to say any words of praise, and he doesn't need to show any expression of praise. He just keeps eating with his head down and adds rice 3 or 4 times in a row." She suddenly remembered that she was talking about an old friend who had not eaten in the official residence for more than 3 years. She was talking about a prince of the empire, and she was talking about her husband's biggest enemy. She stopped talking gloomily. President Pobre held the spoon and looked at his wife silently for a long time. Suddenly, the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes deepened. He laughed and said, "That guy is just born with a big appetite. You have been fooled by him." The laughter gradually disappeared in the small dining room of the official residence. Nobody mentioned Su Lu anymore. President Pobre tore the bread and dipped it in the thick soup, mixed it with green beans and meat, and slowly ate it while watching the TV screen calmly. As the President of the Federation, he rarely watched the news channel of the Federation in his private life. It was the same at this time, because even he did not like the so-called authoritative news channel that was tightly controlled by the government. The private TV station called April Flower was broadcasting important political news. The reporter, who could not hide his excitement, held the microphone and said loudly, "The Supreme Court has announced the immediate repeal of the Patriot Act by a vote of 4-1. More than 2 hours have passed since then, but the silent parade still has not left Robbie Boulevard. Tens of thousands of people are celebrating here, and we have found that more and more citizens of the capital are joining the celebration crowd." President Pobre did not hear what the reporter said at the end. The voice from the light screen entered his ears and turned into fuzzy noise, making his face turn ugly. He knew the news the moment the Supreme Court announced the immediate repeal of the Patriot Act. That was why he had been walking slowly in the snow with Du Shaoqing earlier. Just when the major forces of the Federation thought that the Federation government he led would suffer a huge setback because of the unconstitutional review and that the president would fly into a rage, he remained calm. He could even quietly have a simple lunch with his wife in the small dining room. President Pobre thought that he could continue to be calm, but he did not expect to see the news at the dinner table full of family love and warmth. It was a completely different feeling from hearing the news in the Oval Office. Listening to the excited reports of the reporters and watching the ordinary people who had been passionately or silently supporting him for more than a decade, more and more people joining the opposition, he suddenly felt that the thick pepper soup had become tasteless. A pair of warm hands gently fell on his shoulders and slowly rubbed back and forth to express their sympathy. President Pobre patted him gently. His wife stood behind his chair and said softly, "Papa, don't forget that I was a lawyer in the past. Although I was only your assistant, I knew that there was a problem with the Patriot Act from the first day I saw it." President Pobre was silent for a moment before he replied, "My dear, I know very well that the Patriot Act is not only problematic, but also completely evil." He turned his head, looked at his wife, and said solemnly, "But at this moment, the Federation needs this evil law, just like a dying patient needs illegal psychostimulating drugs to help them survive the surgery. It is easy for people with a legal background to judge that once the Patriot Act enters the unconstitutional review process, it will definitely be nullified by the Supreme Court of that old judge. So, the government and I have done a lot of procedures to protect it." He stood up, and a self-deprecating smile flashed on his tanned face. He continued, "But the government did not expect that our enemies would be so unscrupulous and start to use violent means when we, who have the most powerful violent organization, have been exercising self-discipline with great difficulty." This sentence was referring to the attack on the sanatorium in Spring City. "Was it done by those big families?" his wife asked worriedly. President Pobre shook his head and said, "It was done by Sue Lo. Whether or not they were behind it, those big families will never admit it, and the government cannot find any evidence." Hearing Sue Lee's name, a hint of shock flashed on his wife's face. Then, she sighed softly and did not say anything more. She picked up the tray and left. Pushing open the door of the bedroom on the second floor, she looked at her daughter who was playing mobile games by the window and said with a smile, "Della, it's time for dinner." Miss Paddell looked up at her mother with a sweet smile, put down the phone, and walked over. The first daughter of the Federation had now grown into a beautiful young lady, but she still seemed unwilling to talk. Stroking her daughter's curly hair lovingly, the wife sighed and said, "It's been 3 years. Sue Lo is indeed a citizen of the Empire. My dear, when will you forgive your father and eat at the same table with him? I just hate the feeling of being forced, as if we are still in prison." Chief Editor Bob said calmly, "Imprisoning the body has nothing to do with the mind. Now that you and I can be heard by the people, we are no longer in prison. And I also want to know if Councilman Fong will be the second President Pobre." He turned his head to look at Wood, smiled, and patted him on the shoulder. He said, "You don't have to go back to the newspaper office. Pick up the pen, and you can still take revenge on society." In January of the 76th year of the constitutional calendar, the snow fell unrested. No one knew when the sparkling snowflakes would fall from the lead gray clouds again. Only the cold wind continued to blow. In the cold wind, Tai Yuan's thin body looked particularly thin, and his face was getting paler and paler. The people around him couldn't help but worry that the young councilman would collapse after coughing again. The reporters who ran the political line all knew that Councilman Fong was not in good health, but no one in the press knew the real reason why his health was getting worse. But for them, pity was the emotion of the fanatical people, but it was definitely not the emotion they should have for the interview. So they held their microphones and recording pens high, and continued to ask questions without pause. Tai Yuan raised his hands and gestured for the crowd to quiet down. Then he answered the reporter in front of him with a serious expression, although Chief Editor Bob and reporter would have been cleared of the ugly and unfair accusations, and the government has to formally apologize and explain this, the government has to bear the relevant judicial responsibility for the cruel and inhumane treatment the two of them suffered during the interrogation by the Joint Investigation Department. The reporter asked, "Councilman, do you mean to pursue criminal responsibility? Then which of the government's serial departments will be involved in the indictment? The Patriot Act has been abolished, so the Joint Investigation Department, which has dangerous high authority, has lost all reason to exist. It must be disbanded immediately." Tai Yuan's answer was simple and direct, and it was strong and powerful. A male reporter squeezed to the front of the crowd, raised the recording pen in his hand, and asked loudly, "During the silent march last night, the first 7 Group's officer, Da Vinci, appeared on the podium and claimed that he was persecuted by the government. But according to the military's investigation, this officer fled after killing his comrades on the front lines of Planet Mo. There are related videos, and many soldiers of the new 11th Division can prove that this person once colluded with the Empire's soldiers. This person called Da Vinci has been confirmed as a rebel. Letting a rebel officer viciously attack the soldiers of the Federation who were still fighting on the front lines, shamelessly framing the Federation government in order to wash away his sins. Mr. Councilman, how do you plan to explain this matter?" The reporters present knew very well that this male reporter was from the Tribune, which was close to Pobre's government, but they also wanted to know how Tai Yuan would answer. The Tribune reporter did not end his sharp questions there. He threw out another bombshell and asked, "According to the Bureau of Proclamation, a spy of the Empire has infiltrated the Federation. With the political situation in the Federation in turmoil, what does the Empire want to do? You and your demonstration team have seriously interfered with the daily operations of the government and caused great harm to the front lines. Is there any connection between the rebel officer named Da Vinci, the abolition of the Patriot Act, the Empire's people, and this silent march? In the context of this war, any factor that involved the Empire would become sensitive and dangerous." Hearing the reporter's question, the crowd suddenly fell silent. Countless eyes fell on Tai Yuan's face. Tai Yuan narrowed his eyes and stared at the reporter coldly. He found that the other party did not back down but had a provocative look. He vaguely guessed that the government was looking for the right time to announce his former friendship with the Empire's Prince Su Lo as the most powerful countermeasure. Da Vinci is a rebel. Tai Yuan stared at the other party coldly. His voice became sharper and more unyielding. Then is he a rebel who fought on the front lines for 4 years, or a rebel whose legs were blown off and will be disabled for life? Without waiting for the Tribune reporter to refute, Tai Yuan narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "I'm a retired officer of the glorious Federation. I've not only held a pen in my hand like you, I've also held a gun. I'm not hiding in the safety of the Capitol Ring, sitting on the sofa with a pen in my hand and killing imaginary soldiers of the Empire in order to love some people of the Federation." Tai Yuan stared at the reporter who had an extremely ugly expression and said word by word, "I've been on the front lines. I've resisted the invasion of the Empire with the guns and bullets in my hands. I've killed countless soldiers of the Empire who rushed in front of me. Those cruel and barbaric soldiers of the Empire are not just imaginary images that only exist in the minds of people like you. They are real people. Therefore, you should ask the people of the Empire what they want to do, not me. If you and your newspaper company try to connect me with the people of the Empire in the future and insult the dignity and honor of a retired officer of the Federation, I will not hesitate to shoot you just like I did to the people of the Empire." The Tribune reporter looked at the thin and weak young senator in shock. He was at a loss for what to do because of the sudden pressure from the other party. Chapter 962. Silence, silence. Tai Yuan did not continue his outburst. He turned to the reporter who asked the first question and said softly, "You just asked how far we should go. My request is simple. Parliament must hold a special hearing to investigate the explosion of the ancient bell, the 7 Group incident on Planet Mo, and immediately reopen the impeachment case. All suspected criminal officials of the Federation government must be put on trial. The trial of the conspirators." This was the headline of the special issue published by the Tribune, one of the 3 major newspapers of the Federation, that night. The special issue believed that there was an unspeakable conspiracy behind the major events of the Federation in the past 6 months. Some decadent reactionary families intended to incite the blind people, provoke the antagonism of the dangerous classes, and intensify social conflicts, so as to carry out a strong counterattack to achieve the goal of prolonging the sinful lives. The contents of the 3 major pages of the report carried out and even developed the illusions or insinuations of the reporter during the day. They directly pointed the spearhead at the silent march, at the silent 7 families, and at the young Senator Tais Yuan. Below the eye-catching headline on the front page was a political article written by President Pobre himself. In the article, he calmly answered some of the most important questions of the people and expressed his views on the political affairs of the Federation in the past 3 years. Then in the conclusion, he wrote, "The real enemy of tolerance is fanaticism. But the ones who challenge tolerance are often not those fanatics with firm beliefs, but often these people. They want to dispel their own doubts, and at the same time, they want to seal the mouths of others and bind their hands and feet. They want to bind our hands and feet, so they do everything they can to repeal the Patriot Act. They want to seal the mouths of others, so they use all kinds of means to threaten, hold, or bribe the media." George Carlin once said that the only strength the will of the weak can possess is fanaticism. If the cowardly strong who control the resources of society will only use the last strength of the weak like you and me to achieve their own personal goals, then why should we be lenient to them? Mr. President's writing was still strong and moving, like the eloquence on the podium, but in today's Federation, it could no longer arouse as many enthusiastic responses and support as it did in the past. There were many people who were deep in thought when they saw the text, but no matter what school of thought they were, they all maintained a cautious silence for the time being. The next morning, another major newspaper that had been silent for a long time, the Capital Special District Daily News, made a quick response. In an inconspicuous corner of the second page, the editors enthusiastically cheered for the freedom of the chief editor and chief reporter. At the same time, they published a simple response from Mr. Bob to the president at the end. "If the opposite of fanaticism is callousness, then when you choose callousness, don't blame the people for naturally choosing fanaticism." Inside the temporary tent in front of the George Carlin Art Center, Chief Editor Bob, who had not slept all night, picked up a half-extinguished core cigarette and took a sip. He then rubbed his dry eyes and was about to drink the bitter coffee that Torres personally prepared to end the second official political essay when he saw Wood lift the curtain and come in. The response is simple and powerful, but why is it on the second page? Reporter Wood grabbed his coffee cup and took a sip. He frowned at the bitter and thick juice, then shook his head and said, "Torres really knows your habits, but when did you go through the divorce procedures? She has been waiting for you for so many years. The opposition of the children is greater." Chief Editor Bob smiled bitterly and said, "This just answers your first question. In my opinion, responding to Mr. President's cliché is not even as important as dealing with family issues." Wood waved the special issue of the Forum that he had read all night and said with emotion, "Mr. Pobre, who has relied on the fanatical support of the people for decades to grow from an orphan in a mining area to the president of the Federation, has actually started to be wary of the word fanaticism. This is really a ridiculous thing. History is always easy to make those who have lived long enough to feel ridiculous." Bob said, that year, that Senator Medellin wrote more than a dozen eloquent editorials. Who would have thought that he was from the Empire at that time? Who would have thought that his opponent in the election would actually start to write editorials now? Political history will always be so boring and repetitive. Wood frowned and looked at the demonstrators who were consciously cleaning up the garbage outside the tent. He said thoughtfully, "Will Tais Yuan be different? The difference between politicians and politicians is like the difference between a painter and a painter. The former can't retain the original truth and feelings, and is always a repetitive manual work. They only need to achieve their goals, such as making money or fame." Chief Editor Bob said with emotion, "When Pobre stepped into the politics of the Federation from a down-and-out law firm, we had just entered the news circle. Since then, I have been shouting and defending for him, because I feel that he is an anomaly in the political circle. He is a fresh stream, and he is most likely to become a politician, not a politician with a stomach full of lust and a brain full of bank card passwords. Unfortunately, the reality is always so disappointing. Chapter 963. Voting represented the political rights that the people gave to the members of Parliament. Raising or lowering their hands represented their attitude. However, in Parliament Hill, some members were playing with their fingers in boredom, some were sleeping on their arms, and some were playing games on their phones. The National Security Advisor was explaining the Homeland Security law in detail, and the members of the PAC faction were asking questions with a serious expression. Occasionally, there would be warm applause, but in the eyes of these minority members, it was as if it didn't exist. Since the problem couldn't be solved through voting, then it was better to just silently resist. Members of Parliament, Parliament Hill is the last bastion of justice for the Federation. In order to win this war with the Empire, in order to protect the greatest justice of the people, I hereby ask that you raise your hands and pass the Homeland Security law. The National Security Advisor ended his explanation and nodded with a smile, indicating that he should step down. The host of the meeting looked at the schedule and said into the microphone, "Next, let's welcome Lieutenant Colonel Yunpeng from the Department of Defense to speak." On the pathway paved with expensive wooden planks, a wheelchair slowly and firmly moved up. The young officer on the wheelchair had a firm expression, as calm as the blanket covering his broken leg. "Are you Colonel Yunpeng?" The host frowned as he looked at the wheelchair in front of the podium, feeling that this officer looked somewhat familiar. The officer shook his head and replied, "No, I'm Major Da Vinci from the new 17th Division." Hearing this name, the members of Parliament who were playing with their fingers in boredom stiffened. The members who were sleeping on their arms suddenly sat up straight, and the members who were playing games on their phones subconsciously looked up. The originally lifeless Parliament Hill was suddenly filled with exclamations. A few members of the PAC faction stood up in shock. After hesitating for a moment to confirm the identity of this person, they began to shout for the guards. The guards at the various entrances quickly rushed to the podium. Da Vinci, who was sitting in the wheelchair, didn't seem to notice the danger at all. He stared at the dense crowd of members of Parliament below the podium and spoke at an extremely fast speed. Mr. National Security Advisor said that Parliament Hill is the last bastion of justice for the Federation. You are sitting here because the people have given you the right to sit here. Then why can't you take the time to listen to the voices of the real soldiers on the front lines? The guards had already rushed to the rostrum. The guard at the front pulled out a stun baton from his waist. A guard grabbed his wheelchair, and a guard roughly grabbed his collar, trying to twist his two remaining hands to the handcuffs behind his back. With his wheelchair overturned, Leonardo da Vinci struggled with all his might. His military uniform that was densely decorated with military medals and decorations was torn apart. Lying on the ground, he looked at the distant dome of Parliament Hill and roared angrily, "Damn it! You bunch of cowards!" Faced with this disabled officer's angry reprimand, some of the councillors frowned slightly. Then, they slowly lowered their heads and continued to play with their fingers. The other councillors stood up and waved their arms, cursing angrily in response. They also booed him mercilessly. At this moment, the councillor who was playing mobile games frowned. He slammed his mobile phone on the table and said, "Wait. Wait for the rebel officers to deliver a vicious speech attacking the Federation on Parliament Hill. Larry, you have to remember that this is the Sacred Federation's meeting room, not the gathering place of some hooligans. Please remember your identity and don't do anything stupid." Da Vinci was pressed to the wooden floor by the guards. In his eyes were the magnificent crystal chandelier hanging in the dome and the rostrum high above. He was still sad, but he did not have the tragic feeling of a desperate person. He gave up resistance and laughed loudly like a lunatic. The Federation News Channel is broadcasting the meeting room live. The whole Federation is watching how you treat a disabled major. Mr. Councillors, it seems that you are really not worried about being abandoned by the voters. No one believed the threat of this officer. Indeed, there were 12 cameras set up by the Federation news channel in front and behind the rostrum. However, this was the usual practice of the Parliament Mountain. There was no news broadcast today. At this moment, the main light screen behind the rostrum suddenly lit up like a white wall. The quality of the light screen was very poor. Only a few blurry faces could be seen, but the logo of the Federation news channel clearly appeared in the upper left corner of the screen. Under the logo, there were two clear words, live broadcast. The whole Parliament Mountain was in an uproar. The councillors who had just sat down after satisfying their anger and curses stood up again in shock. They looked around for possible surveillance cameras as if they had seen a ghost. The picture gradually became clear, revealing a handsome but extremely violent face. Next to this face, there were 7 or 8 officers wearing the uniform of the Federation. The Parliament Mountain gradually quieted down. All the councillors' eyes fell on the light screen and recognized the identity of this officer. It was a video email from the forward base of Planet Inkflower, from the front line of the war. In the video email, the young and proud colonel of the Federation frowned and stared coldly at the camera. He said, "As a soldier of the Federation, I should not be involved in politics. However, because of the request of a woman I love, I will make an exception and make the following explanation to the Parliament of the Federation and the people." There are 3 sentences in total. I am Colonel Li Feng, the current commander of the 17th Division of the Federation's 1st Military Region. The officers next to me are all officers of the 17th Division. I don't know what Major Da Vinci wants to say when he enters Parliament Mountain. I only know that he is definitely not a rebel officer. That's all I have to say. After a few simple sentences, the video email ended. The projection of the Parliament Mountain Master returned to the live broadcast of the news channel of the Federation. In other words, it returned to the scene of the Parliament Mountain. Hundreds of councillors looked at themselves on the light screen with complicated expressions. Looking at the eye-catching live broadcast logo, thinking about the testimony of Colonel Li Feng, they fell into a long silence. In any case, the simple testimony of a colonel of the Federation was definitely not enough to overthrow the command of the Federation military. Not to mention, the way he gave his testimony was so ridiculous and comical that it showed such disrespect to Parliament Mountain. However, this colonel was called Li Feng. He was the hero of the Federation, Madman Li, the only son of Chairman Li Jadu, and the direct successor of the Lees of Philadelphia. Therefore, the weight of these 3 simple sentences was different. The silence of Parliament Mountain was broken by 2 uneasy councillors. They looked at the confused military police below the rostrum and shouted, "Why aren't you arresting him? What do you want to do?" At this time, sitting at the highest point of the rostrum, the old man who seemed to be in a deep sleep for the past 3 years and had almost never opened his mouth except when he had to speak suddenly opened his eyes slowly. Chapter 964. The Deputy Speaker of the Federation Management Committee, Mr. Zion, glanced at the hundreds of members in the audience with his old eyes and said lightly, "Since even Colonel Li Feng believes that Major Leonardo da Vinci is not a rebel, then I think we should listen to what Major Leonardo da Vinci has to say." The members of the PAC faction, who had the absolute majority, were stunned and began to get restless. Zion's eyes were cold as he scolded in a deep voice, "Members, this disabled Major Leonardo da Vinci doesn't have a gun on him. Is he a threat to your safety? Pay attention to your manners. The whole Federation is watching you." The first time in 3 years that the Deputy Speaker of the Federation made a strong statement, it seemed that it was not enough to simply suppress the members of the PAC faction, who had become used to being tough after the midterm elections. The members of the Black Me faction were still protesting loudly. The face of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation was slightly gloomy. He raised the hammer in his right hand and slammed it on the smooth and hard pearwood castanets. The crisp and resounding sound of the collision suddenly resounded throughout the spacious Parliament Hill, but it did not end there. As the Deputy Speaker slowly and monotonously raised his arm and brought the hammer down, the sound continued to ring out, overlapping like the waves of the sea, one wave after another. The noise of the drums gradually quieted down, and the sound of the hammer stopped abruptly. The eyes of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation were slightly closed, as if he was about to fall asleep again. However, the words that came out of his mouth were indifferent. If anyone disturbs the order of the meeting again, I will ask the military police to take him out for 3 days. The members of the Pack faction and the audience looked at each other. They were used to the silence of the old man sitting at the highest seat of the chairman. It was not until now that they remembered that although they had the absolute advantage in the vote on the Parliament Hill, as the Deputy Speaker, he had a lot of procedural rights that were stipulated in the Charter. After a moment of silence and awkwardness, the most fanatical member could only suppress his anger and uneasiness and sit down angrily. The military police under the podium awkwardly let go of Leonardo da Vinci, put down the wheelchair, and then carried him to the chair. The wheelchair slowly moved to the microphone. Leonardo da Vinci carefully tidied up his military uniform and arranged the military medal neatly on the left side of his chest. Then he combed his hair with his fingers, pulled down the microphone, and calmed down for a moment before he began to speak. Almost at the same time, countless phones rang in the arms of the members of Parliament one after another. Hundreds of secretaries in the offices of the members of Parliament ran madly through the corridors with their phones and folders in their hands, looking for their members. What was happening on Parliament Hill was being broadcasted live on the Federation News Channel and shown on the public's TV screens. Suddenly realizing that this seemingly meaningless meeting had an unexpected turn of events, the ordinary people could only express their shock and confusion. Meanwhile, the faces hidden behind the councillors reacted immediately and dialed their phones. Winsky stood beside a secluded passageway in the capital airport. Looking at the TV screen above his head, he subconsciously covered his mouth and almost exclaimed. She looked around nervously, worried that she would attract other people's attention. She quickly put down her hand and tidied up her slightly curly hair. As the most popular female news anchor in the Federation in the past 10 years, the dignified and intelligent Winsky had a face that the public was most familiar with. For you, it's more unacceptable for the family in the official residence to be hurt than for the president to be threatened. Winsky held the strap of the lady's handbag tightly and didn't say anything. Han Chu continued expressionlessly, so when we found out about the relationship between you and the president, we only asked you to help us do things in the news channel. If we asked for more, you definitely wouldn't accept. But why do you want me to leave? Winsky asked nervously. A strange smile flashed across Han Chu's pale face. He said, now that the news channel has started broadcasting, the Silent March team has entered the capital. You are no longer of much use to us. Of course, we can leave you alone, but I think the president will vent his anger on you afterward. Winsky slowly lowered her head. Behind the wide sunglasses was a sad expression. She said in a trembling voice, no, he wouldn't do that to me. You should know better than us what kind of man the president is. Han Chu looked at her with slight ridicule and said, if you really believed that he wouldn't be so heartless, you wouldn't have agreed to leave the Federation today. Winsky raised her head and stared at his pale face. She asked, even if he wants to kill me, why do you care if I live or die? Exposing the president's lover is already beyond the boundary of a sex scandal. It's very useful to you. You are indeed the best news anchor in the Federation. Even at this time, your mind is still so clear. Han Chu sighed with a complicated expression. He looked at her and said, what you said was actually my initial plan. Unfortunately, this insidious and perfect plan was rejected by him because he thought that there was indeed love between you and the president. He felt that this kind of thing should be respected. Winsky held the strap of the handbag tightly and didn't speak again. She knew that the man beside her was talking about was the underworld king of Bermuda. However, as the president's secret lover, it was difficult for her to be shocked by other so-called big shots. She just silently listened to the words of love relayed by the other party and then silently asked herself in her heart if she had betrayed love. I didn't betray you. Sitting on a spaceship heading to Bermuda in the southwest part of the capital airport, the female anchor looked at the familiar scenery outside the window and silently said in her heart, "In the beginning, I really wanted to protect you, but I didn't expect that those Bermudians would have such a terrifying degree of control over people's hearts." There was a thin layer of snow on the side of the spaceship. The new type of snow melting agent was working efficiently. The layer of snow quickly turned into a strange pattern. The female anchor looked out of the window. Her fingertips pierced deeply into her palms. There were traces of blood oozing out. Perhaps it was because of this that the skin around the sunglasses was unusually pale. "My love. I'm sorry, good luck." The spaceship to Bermuda was about to take off. Sadly, she sent the last text message to the man in the official residence and then turned off the phone. Not far away, beside the transparent wall of the underground passage of the airport, Han Chu silently watched the spaceship disappear into the lead clouds. A faint smile appeared on his pale cheeks. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number. He whispered, "It's done." Black ordinary roads traversed the fields. In the Federation's old-style farms, it was extremely rare, so it retained a lot of the flavor of the past. Lin Banshan hung up the phone and looked at the snow-covered haystacks and frozen water wheels passing by the car window from time to time. His face showed a look of yearning and admiration. The car stopped in front of a very inconspicuous courtyard. Lin Banshan walked to the wooden door and politely knocked on the door. The director, reporter, cameraman, engineer, and director all knew that there was something wrong with each other, but they did not know what the problem was. They could only do as those people asked and had no choice at all. The director looked at the incomparably lively scene in Parliament Hill on the TV screen and pretended not to hear the phone ringing on his desk because he knew that the call was definitely from the government. After a moment, he glanced uneasily at the electrician in the corner who had lowered his head to do his work. It took a lot of effort for him to swallow his bitter saliva. The person who could decide the content of the news department was no longer him, nor the government, but the electrician who had been hired a few months ago, because this electrician represented the attitude of those people. The staff members inside and outside the studio of the news department suddenly became nervous. Their bodies stiffened as they looked over there. A female editor even almost fainted because they saw that the electrician who had been squatting in the corner suddenly stood up. The electrician hung up the phone in his hand and walked to the window to take a look. He turned back and calmly said to the crowd, "Because the floor is too high, you probably can't hear the noise below. I just want to tell you one thing. You don't have to worry about the government sending military police to arrest you because the Federation TV station building is now surrounded by silent marching troops. They can't enter. Director Brin, we really can't go in. There are at least tens of thousands of people surrounding this place. How can my people go in?" The streets around the Federation TV station building were already occupied by the crowd. Tens of thousands of protesters wearing black masks raised their hands and blocked a dozen black SUVs and even more police cars outside. Beside one of the black SUVs, the deputy director of the Federation Investigation Bureau had an extremely ugly expression. Looking at the sea of people on the streets, he roared into the phone in his hand, "Send a helicopter. Tens of thousands of people are surrounding this building. Seeing the helicopter land on the roof, they will definitely rush in. When the time comes, will you bear the responsibility or will I bear the responsibility? You bear the responsibility. Even if you bear the responsibility, you won't dare to give the order. The deputy director hung up the phone angrily. The scene in Parliament Hill appeared on the screens of tens of thousands of households through the Federation News Channel. The Federation government made the quickest response at the first moment. The news channel was the most authoritative and trustworthy media in the Federation society. If the accusations of the Team 7 Major were broadcasted through this media, and in such a shocking manner, then no matter how the government explained, it would be difficult to dispel the suspicion and anger of the public. This had nothing to do with evidence. Just like what a certain Dong Lin police officer said many years ago, the lives of the ignorant were filled with soap operas provided by the upper class. Therefore, the majority of the Federation's lower-class citizens didn't care whose evidence was stronger. They only believed what they wanted to believe, what they saw with greater visual impact, the so-called truth. The Federation government reacted quickly, but they didn't expect that the young senator seemed to have been prepared. Just as the Federation Investigation Bureau agents and police arrived in front of the news channel building, the place had already become a sea of people. The Silent March Command Center had been moved from the entrance of the George Carlin Art Center to an apartment building 2 kilometers away from the Federal Television Building. The owner of this apartment building was Li Xiaotong. As early as 3 months ago, the 7th young master had sent away all the tenants and secretly moved in the relevant equipment, just waiting for today to be handed over to the young senator. How many TV stations have already started broadcasting the news channel signal? For now, it's still 3. Increase the number to 10 in 2 minutes. The technical department will send out the signal frequency. If there are any problems with the reception of the TV stations, you will be responsible for solving it immediately. Yes. What's the situation on the various online forums? 74% is at the top. Keywords such as the Team 7 incident and Da Vinci have already occupied 6 of the top 10 search rankings. Public Relations Department, continue to follow up. Also, the thousands of underground music stations, once the funds are received, ask them to stop selling aphrodisiacs today. All of them will be on the government's dark side. If there isn't enough information, send out the prepared broadcast stories. As for the newspapers, how many are still unwilling to publish? All the entertainment weeklies have already bought out their pages. A few major liberal newspapers have already decided to publish special editions. The problem is that the few newspapers that support the government are still unwilling to agree. Has the contract for the advertising space from Sanlin Bank been faxed? It has been faxed, and it is being reviewed. Especially the Tribune, it was stated in the contract in advance that the advertising content cannot have political content. The top 2 floors of the apartment building had already been hollowed out. Hundreds of silent military headquarters staff were busy with the work at hand, turning the originally extremely empty hall into a tense headquarters. At the desk in the deepest part of the hall, the tired young senator put his hands on the table. A grand performance called How to Destroy the Federation Government. Tai Ziyuan took the teacup from Bai Qi's hand and took a sip with a frown. The tea was very hot and thick, which was exactly what he needed the most at this time. He put the hot teacup on a book, looked at Zhou Yu, and said with a smile, "If you admire me now, you are also admiring our president. I used to admire him very much, and I have been learning from him." Under the teacup, the title of the thick book was Pobre's Study of the Popular Movement. But you have to admit that this kind of thing always requires talent. Whether it is you or President Pobre, you both have this kind of talent. If it were Su Lu or Lin Banshan, the former might raise his arms and shout loudly, leading 100,000 people directly into the president's official residence, while the latter would probably incite the masses to die together with the government. In the end, he would leave in a carefree manner. Zhou Yu mocked her 2 absent companions to her heart's content. Tai Yuan coughed lightly and said, "Actually, these are just some very complicated affairs. They are not as complicated and difficult as they seem. Just like the siege of the building and the Parliament Hill. If one person can't do it, 10 people won't do it either. Only when there are enough people, so many that there is a huge disparity between them and the enemy, can humans often develop courage. Dripping water can penetrate stone, but it requires tens of thousands or hundreds of millions of water droplets. A stream is clear, but it can only flow calmly. It lacks the power to change the environment. Only when the stream converges into a river and finally into an ocean will it become powerful and fearless. If every drop of water is raised at this time, it will become a roaring wave. And the so-called leader is actually the canal that divides the water." Tai Yuan lowered his gaze slightly and looked at the dark face that was half covered by the teacup on the cover of the book. His responsibility is to guide the water to the place where it is needed. Some water is used for irrigation, some is used to wash away the sand, and some must be forced to overflow. Because only by overflowing can the enemy be stopped from crossing the river. Of course, water is a metaphor. Tai Yuan said, "If someone tries to make a real flood to stop the enemy, then I don't know what to say." Leonardo da Vinci broke into the Parliament Hill. Madman Lee sent back a video email as proof, the first time in 3 years that the deputy speaker of Xi and took a tough stance. The news channel broadcasted it live, and the people's movement became more and more intense. For the government of the Federation, this was an unexpected setback and danger. But for those who had been silent for a long time, the blurred faces in the shadow of the Federation, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for, and it might even be the last opportunity. On the terrace of the back mountain, Secretary Shin began to make a call. In the manner of the southern minister, Madame Chow began to make a call. On the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank, Li Xiuzhu began to make a call. In the villa of the Ivy Garden, Li Xiaotong began to make a call. Somewhere on the planet S3, Lin Dohai stared at the news channel and roared fiercely at the senator on the phone, "I don't care. I gave you 30 million when I was 16 years old. Why do you think I did that?" Chapter 965. Make things difficult. Make things difficult, my ass. The famous hedonistic son of the Lin family roared furiously into the phone, "Don't blindly trick me. Let me tell you, my big brother is in the capital right now. Watch that hand of yours that you use to vote later. Raise it when you should, and don't blindly raise it when you shouldn't. Otherwise, be careful of getting it chopped off." Due to his excessive fear of Sulu, even though the other party had long been confirmed to be a citizen of the empire, Lin Dohai still only dared to obediently stay on planet S3. He was sick of seeing the beautiful ladies at the Flowing Fire Festival and eating the local specialty dumplings. Today, even this incompetent, mediocre, and foolish second-generation descendant had begun to take action. Moreover, he was able to find a target he could control in Parliament Mountain. One could only imagine what kind of commotion it would cause when the 7 clans went all out today. Da Vinci's wheelchair was pushed up to the rostrum. Low whispers rose and fell in succession in Parliament Mountain. The staff members ran around with grim expressions. The councillors had shocked and complicated expressions. All of this was because of these calls from the shadows. However, this was not enough. At the very least, it was not enough to determine the direction of Parliament Mountain. After the midterm elections, Pobre's political faction had obtained an enormous voting advantage in Parliament Mountain. It was precisely because of this advantage that the Federation government had continuously passed relevant bills to deal continuous blows to the opposition. If the 7 great clans could control Parliament Mountain, then why would they have remained silent for such a long time? And why would Tai Yuan's first impeachment not even pass the first reading of the procedure? The councillors and their companions discussed with their heads lowered. Some of them had nervous expressions, some of them had cold expressions, and some of them had complicated expressions. After a quick calculation, the councillors were stunned to discover that if there were no new changes, the situation on Parliament Mountain would not change because of these calls. Right at this moment, in the Shisha State's governor's office, the governor with a gloomy expression dialed a number and said in a tough tone, "The Pabre and Shi factions are just your words." "That's right, Shisha State has always supported His Excellency the President, but from now on, they will no longer support him. Councillor Shao, you should know very well that without Shisha State support, how could you have been elected as a councillor of the Federation? As Shisha State's representative in the Federation Management Committee, you must faithfully carry out the wishes of the people of your state." "How much determination do I have?" the governor said in a deep voice. "Raise your head and look at the wheelchair on the stage. My son is sitting on it. He is right in front of you. Regarding the National Security Bill, I represent Shisha State to request that you vote against it." No. This was not enough. What can be exchanged for my son's legs? He is such an outstanding young man. When the governor heard Councilman Shao's question, the bloody picture of his son being chased by the federal forces on the front line of the Mo Hua planet and having his legs blown off by the bomb popped up in his eyes. He roared like an enraged lion, "I want you to raise your hands and impeach the goddamn shoe polish president." In the chairman's office of a large pharmaceutical company in Gangdu, the old former chairman looked at the letter left by his son and then glanced at the TV news. After a moment of silence, he finally dialed the phone and said softly, "Councilman Scree, my old friend, there is something I must trouble you with today. I know this request is a bit excessive, but you should remember that I once told you that my son was once a member of Team 7 in the army. He is now fighting against the government. If the government wins, only death awaits him. Therefore, I want to use our lifelong friendship to ask for your help." In the Autumn Mountain Villa district, a rich lady with disheveled hair was sitting on the bed, surrounded by messy balls of paper. She shouted into the phone, "If you still insist on your bullshit political ethics, I will ask my husband to stop all financial support for your office. Your sister-in-law will never get a penny from me again." The lady fiercely wiped away the tears on her face and said hatefully, "Councilman Sun Yeyu, if this still can't convince you, you can guess what even crazier things a mother who has lost her only son will do." After the first wave of intensive phone attacks on Parliament Hill ended, there was a temporary silence. Just as they were about to proceed to the relevant questioning phase, the phone rang again. This time, it was the neutral councilman and even the PAC faction's councilman who had extremely complicated or ugly expressions. Half an hour later, President Pabre was silently watching the voting on Parliament Hill at this time in his official residence. When he saw that the Homeland Security Bill did not pass on the first reading, and when he heard the report from his subordinates, he remembered the faint worry he felt when talking to Du Xiaoqing. He remembered something from years ago. Through the documentary produced by the Golden Star Documentary Studio, the Federation got to know Team 7. In everyone's impression, Team 7 was a brave, united, and fearless fighting group. Every member was the bravest warrior. However, under the cover of those dazzling deeds, people had long forgotten that not every member of Team 7 was so unparalleled from the beginning. The members of the Pabre faction, who were obviously not mentally prepared, subconsciously stood up and looked around, as if they wanted to distinguish who voted against the bill. This was the first time since the midterm elections that Parliament Hill successfully rejected a bill proposed by the Pabre government. This scene had not happened for a long time, and it made the members fall into a strange silence. It seemed that everyone was not used to it. The chairman of the Parliament's Judicial Committee, Senator Shao, slowly stood up from his seat and said in an emotionless voice, "Based on the accusation of the new 17th Division's Major Da Vinci, as well as the material submitted by Senator Tai Ziyuan a few days ago, I suggest restarting the impeachment case against the president. According to the charter, we invite the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, He-ing, to come and preside over the impeachment proceedings. What did you say? Senator Shao, are you crazy? Please don't abuse your authority and waste the resources of the Federation. Hearing the words of the chairman of the Judicial Committee, the members of the Pobre faction stood up together in anger and waved the digital pens in their hands to express their biggest protest. They stared fiercely at the senior senator from Shisha State, as if they were staring at the most shameful traitor. The quiet and solemn Parliament Hill was attacked by obscenities like a market. One could even clearly hear the sound of shoes knocking on the table and fists tearing through the air. It was chaos. Deputy Speaker Xian didn't seem to hear the fierce protests at all. He lightly knocked on the hard pear board in front of him, gave a slight warning, and said expressionlessly, "Now, we will immediately begin the first reading of the procedure." According to the charter, the Federation Parliament had the right to impeach the president. However, even people who didn't understand the rules could imagine that it would be an extremely difficult process to implement this right. The first step of the standard impeachment process was for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Federation to preside over the trial. All members of the Parliament acted as the judges of the impeachment court and listened to the arguments of the prosecution and the testimony of the relevant witnesses. The chairman of the Judicial Committee and the representatives of the sponsors played the role of the prosecution, while the president's official residents had to perform the duty of self-defense. After the trial began, both sides would first make statements for 2 hours, and then call the relevant witnesses to testify. After the cross-examination of the witnesses and the end of the debate, the Chief Justice questioned each member of the Parliament in alphabetical order of the impeachment charges. At this time, the Parliament members could only answer guilty or not guilty. If more than 2/3 of the Parliament members answered guilty to any of the charges, the President would be impeached and replaced by the Vice President. The impeached President would not be able to hold any public office for the rest of his life. If he committed a criminal offense, he would be tried by a normal court after he regained his civilian status. Before these processes, the Parliament Hill had to first pass the impeachment proposal of the Judicial Committee through a third reading. Although only half of the Parliament members were required to pass, it was often the most intense process of debate and all kinds of procedural issues. From this, it was clear that the Parliament Hill had a long and torturous process from the introduction of the impeachment proposal to the official start of the debate in the Court of Charges to the final result. When Speaker Zion announced the start of the preliminary process of voting, there was a commotion in the Parliament Hill. The Parliament members of various factions stood up and attacked each other. Some tried to delay the process by using this method, while others mocked each other for being as childish as children. The Parliament members were all immersed in the battle that was like a warm-up in a boxing ring. The staff in the Parliament members' offices had already started to act. They kept making phone calls to purchase daily necessities, including toiletries, and asked the Parliament members' personal assistants to immediately bring the bedding that the Parliament members were most comfortable with. The most experienced members of the Parliament's office immediately informed the Parliament members' favorite restaurants to prepare the ingredients for takeout. At the top of the rostrum, Deputy Speaker Zion's eyelids drooped as he said softly, "Dear Parliament members, please make as much noise as you want. But I would like to remind you not to leave the Parliament Hill. Any attempt to cause a lack of votes by not being present is not possible today." Deputy Speaker Zion slowly raised his head and looked at the Parliament members of the PAC faction who had anxious and embarrassed expressions. He said, "Even if you can bribe the guards, would like to know how you are going to bribe the tens of thousands of Federation citizens outside. A tempting game would always attract playful children to stay up all night and devote themselves to it. And this game on the Parliament Hill that might change history would definitely force the Parliament members who were physically weak to stay up all night and devote themselves to it, whether due to old age, lust, alcohol, or other reasons. If nothing unexpected happened, this would definitely be the longest Parliament debate and vote in the history of the Federation." Before a certain parliament member said yes or a no, no one would know what the final result would be. If it wasn't for this black car, and if it wasn't for Lu Jiao driving, perhaps he would have been surrounded by them more than 10 hours ago. At this time, Xiong Lingquan's panting voice finally sounded in the communication frequency. We are retreating. Iron 7 Division is a bunch of trash. I wish I could put the infrared sensor on the motherfucking old moon. We've been discovered. I repeat, we are retreating. Su Lu narrowed his eyes. Although Du Shaoqing was now the commander of the Federation, Iron 7 Division was still the terrifying Iron 7 Division from back then. Everyone, retreat. He did not hesitate to give the order and quickly said, don't leave any Hawkeye. Pay attention, don't leave a single one. He believed that in the current situation, Iron 7 Division would definitely not leave the garrison area to pursue. He then asked, Yan Bingyan, how are things on your side? A moment later, a rough voice sounded in the communication frequency, Boss, the three of us are circling around the Snow Leopard assault team. Those bastards aren't very good, but their equipment is too fucking advanced. We can't hold on for much longer. Su Lu reached out and pulled up the electronic map in the car. He looked at a certain light spot on the map and said, go straight at full speed from your coordinates at West 32. You must get out before they encircle you. Get on the train at Taikang and take the high-speed rail to the Golden Fleeting Night Club in the capital of Nank State. There will be people there to meet you. After a pause, he said, as long as you walk into the nightclub alive, you will have completed your mission. Thank you for your hard work. 170 kilometers south of the capital was the Iron 7 Division's newest garrison camp. Opposite the military camp was the continuous Chiu Fu mountain range. The mountain range was not high in this area. It gradually extended to the periphery of Philadelphia and suddenly became a dangerous peak covered with snow. The black car was like a ghost parked in a dense forest in the depths of the mountain ridge. Su Lu carried a black box and a heavy military backpack as he walked out of the car. He hugged Lu Jiao tightly and then parted ways. It took him nearly 2 hours to find a path that no one had ever taken before from the steepest cliff. He quietly hid himself at the highest peak of the mountain opposite the military camp. Behind a gray stone on the mountain peak, Su Lu mobilized the scorching power behind his waist and slowly closed his eyes. He recalled the feeling when he was tens of millions of tons underwater on the Imperial spaceship and let the threads of true chi seep into every cell of his body. The ticking of the second hand moved. His breathing gradually slowed down as time passed. His heartbeat dropped to less than 16 beats per minute. His body temperature also became lower and lower. The Iron 7 Division's military philosophy was strict and meticulous. In addition to the observation posts stipulated by regulations, there were many infrared detectors hidden in the forest around the military camp. But at this time, the infrared detectors that found Xiong Linquan and the other team members could no longer find Su Lu outside the big rock on the mountain peak, because in the infrared imaging, Su Li's body had become a real rock at this time. The heavy black box was opened. The ACW was quickly assembled. The hollow barrel poked out of the crack of the rock. The original tungsten alloy tail fin large caliber bullets had been loaded. Su Lu half lay under the big rock. He tried to control the rhythm of his body to prevent his body temperature from rising. He gently turned the red touch button with his right thumb. As the touch button moved, the miniature hologram of the ACW showed the image of the Iron 7 Division's camp at the foot of the mountain. The high magnification equipment clearly showed the resolute expressions of the Iron 7 Division soldiers, the rows of barracks, and the military MX mecha group that were still training in the middle of the night. Smoke was rising gradually. Su Lu looked at the constantly changing images on the hologram and saw Willow Mubai faintly appear in the distance. He found that the first ray of morning light had fallen on his body uninvited. He couldn't help but squint his eyes. Many years ago, he had controlled the MX Mecha to half-crouch on the mountain peak during the Japanese graduation performance, bathing in the morning light and overlooking the Iron 7 Division's camp. At that time, his opponent was the Iron 7 Division's Defense Battalion. What he had to do was to find the battalion headquarters and defeat Shimin-jin. And today, his opponent was the entire Iron 7 Division. What he had to do was find Du Xiaoqing and kill him. Deep in the alley opposite the General Staff Association's office building, there was a famous Bermuda-style restaurant, famous for its salted pig legs and black beer. Beside the green table on the balcony, Magnolia slowly chewed on the sausages and bread. Her eyes looked out from under the brim of her hat and looked at the building in the distance, full of doubts and uneasiness. In the distant asteroid belt, in the cabin of the black, broken spaceship, the slender mechanical arm was shaking non-stop as it mumbled to itself like a drunk woman, "Bad bomb, where are you? Where are you?" The huge two-dimensional light-beam chessboard was full of black and white chess pieces. The battle with the piece of scrap metal under the Bureau of Proclamation continued to the point where the chessboard was almost full, and Philip was already beginning to feel the strain. For him, the more important problem now was to find the possible bad bombs. From the calculation and analysis of the clues in the Biji Plateau until now, he still hadn't found any suspicious traces. Biderman, with a head of messy and dirty hair, looked thinner than a few days ago. He stared like a madman with pale eyes, drank his coffee mechanically, and asked, "You won't tell me what you are looking for, I can't help you." "This is the core program, I can't tell you," Philip replied. "The problem is, I don't have a database now, and I can't find any historical materials, which means I have no experience." "How can I find it?" In the 76th year of the constitutional calendar, the political situation of the Federation was in turmoil. Hundreds of thousands of silent demonstrators flooded the capital. Although these demonstrators tried their best to maintain good order, the large number of people still greatly affected the traffic and public security in many areas of the capital. Fortunately, like most of the 10 billion people in the Federation, the citizens of the capital basically stayed at home for the past 2 days. They held their bowls of noodles, smoked cigarettes, and drank beer. They were either nervous, excited, or bored, attracted by the live broadcast on the news channel, so the social order didn't become more chaotic. The live broadcast on Parliament Hill entered the drama of the impeachment of President Qing. All the TV stations began to broadcast it live, so some political nihilists found that the remote control was basically useless and angrily smashed the TV screen. At this time, the Federation News Channel suddenly showed a window in the upper right corner of the live broadcast on Parliament Hill. In the window, the host announced the latest news. The State Assembly of Shisha State passed a resolution, and the governor angrily announced on TV that because of the president's shameless behavior, Shisha State would no longer support the current Federation government. Immediately after, S2 State Oak State announced the same content. Then it was S2 State Ring State that surrounded the mountain and the other 3 states. In the midst of the fierce debate on Parliament Hill to start the impeachment process, a total of 17 state assemblies of the Federation passed resolutions to declare that they didn't believe in Pobre's government and asked the president to resign immediately. At this time, except for the West Woods region and Green Dragon Mountain who opposed the government, the political forces of the Federation clearly showed their positions. The states of the East Woods region naturally chose to support Pobre's government, but unfortunately, like many years before, this abandoned planet was easily forgotten. Not many people knew that Zhang Xiaomeng had left the capital special district early and returned to Green Dragon Mountain. In front of the bed, she clearly explained her views to the leader of Nanshui. In the dim room, the leader of Nanshui looked at her with a face full of age spots. Chapter 968. Standing next to Zhong Huiyan was the expressionless Mr. Tian. Both of them were wearing ordinary civilian clothes. Behind them were dozens of Westwood's military officers in well-ironed Federation uniforms. The commander of the 7th Brigade, Zhou Jin, walked to the front of the formation and saluted with a bang. Then he left, followed by the burly commander of the local defense camp, Wang Meng. These Silan soldiers, who had sworn to protect the Zhong family with their lives and blood, received their orders and left in front of the eyes of the entire Federation. Many years ago, one of the ancestors of the Zhong family in the Westwoods had left a famous quote for the Federation: "The Federation does not attack the Federation's people." However, the attitude that the Westwoods military forces showed to the entire Federation today seemed to be the complete opposite of that quote. Would the first civil war in the Federation begin? Would the Westwoods, which had been neither close nor distant to the capital ring for thousands of years, declare independence in defiance of the charter? If it was an old man with a gloomy expression who led Silan's native forces to issue the strongest voice against the capital ring, the Federation society and media would immediately begin condemning him in speech and in writing. They would label him as a maniacal ambitious schemer and a bloodthirsty schemer. However, the one who appeared in front of the entire universe was an orphan girl whose parents were both dead. Most people began to believe that the explosion of the ancient bell was a conspiracy of the federal government. In the face of this pitiful orphan girl who had no one to rely on, it was difficult for anyone to associate her with an ambitious schemer. No one could blame her in the name of morality. On the contrary, the people sympathized with her and pitied her. Therefore, after the Westwoods Declaration was made, anti-government protests spread throughout the Federation. There were two more demands: to oppose the civil war and to ask the government to give justice to the Westwoods. The governor of Xixia State arrived at the capital special district in a special vehicle. He unfurled a very long light screen banner in Charter Square and then was arrested for violating the Traffic Act. The governor did not resist at all because this was his plan. He believed that when the people of Xixia State saw the image of him being handcuffed, more people would leave their apartment buildings and walk on the streets. In order to deal with the situation in the Westwoods and the increasingly tense atmosphere, the 3rd Military Region stationed at S3 started to prepare for war. However, when a mecha operator requested the Duck Mountain Assembly Base to distribute the relevant components, he didn't get a response. The Duck Mountain Assembly Base was the largest logistics base of the Federation. The garrison of the base raised their alert level. The 2 heavy alloy doors slowly closed. Countless heavy firepower groups were ready to fire at any time. In the conference room of the base, several generals of the Federation rejected the 4th transfer request of the 3rd Military Region without hesitation. In the dim front desk, the idle general who was relieved of his post as Minister of Defense 3 years ago and sent to the General Assembly Base turned around and looked at his loyal subordinates. It's true that the military shouldn't have its own thoughts, but with the Constitution, the Federation forces don't fight civil wars. Right now, the Federation is already in a precarious situation. Do we need the help of a person from the Empire to get back on the right track? As a soldier of the Federation, I can't afford to lose face like this. We must save ourselves. These sounds gathered together and became incomparably dull and shocking. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and stared at the image on the miniature screen. A moment later, he saw more than 100 black military MX mechas lined up at high speed like 100 austere gods. Then, they drove out of the barracks in 3 different directions. He noticed that the Iron 7th Division's mechas were extremely cautious and maintained their formation. Meanwhile, the mechas closest to the mountain quickly spread out to expand the surveillance area. Su Li's pupils shrank and his body stiffened even more. The MX Mecha's SCC global surveillance system was designed by Shang Qiu. Even if he closed his eyes, He could calculate how wide an area the Iron 7th Division's mechas could monitor. This area was just a few meters below the giant rock, which meant that he couldn't get any closer to the road. More than a dozen dark green bulletproof military vehicles slowly drove out of the barracks of the Iron 7th Division. Sulu stared at one of the vehicles in the middle. He stared at the face that was still blurry under the ACW's terrifying aiming magnifier. It was as if he could see that pair of sunglasses and that cold expression that had been on that face for thousands of years. Du Shaoqing was definitely in that vehicle. The problem was that the giant rock was too far away from the road. It was beyond the effective shooting range of the ACW. And if Sulu tried to sneak down and get closer, he would definitely alert the dozen or so powerful mechas at the base of the mountain. This was the Iron 7th Division's mecha formation. It looked like a mediocre mecha formation, but it provided perfect protection for the core area. Sulu firmly believed that with the terrifying military discipline of the Iron 7th Division, there would be no gaps in the enemy's mecha formation during the 170-kilometer journey to the capital special district. Sulu licked his lips as he watched the heavy mechas spread out and silently escort the convoy onto the road. He couldn't help but wonder if the enemy had noticed something. Right now, he was faced with a difficult choice. If he was just a cold-blooded killer, he would definitely choose to pick up the ACW and quietly retreat. Then he would wait for a better opportunity to shoot. But he wasn't a killer. What he needed to do was to stop Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division from entering the capital. He couldn't wait any longer. Just then, the phone in his pocket suddenly vibrated. Below the mountain was an entire division, the Federation's strongest Iron 7th Division. More than 100 terrifying military MX mechas were scattered across the field. Behind the dozen or so military vehicles, hundreds of armored vehicles were rushing over. He only had one person and one gun. Should I thank you for your ridiculous trust in me? The moment Sulu closed his eyes, he sent the most respectful greetings to the lady in his mind. Then he suddenly turned around, picked up the heavy ACW, and jumped onto the rock under the sun. He aimed at the military vehicle on the road below the mountain. Without any hesitation, he stood on the rock and used the most standard horizontal shooting position. He narrowed his eyes and pulled the trigger at the military vehicle in the distance. On the balcony behind Macho Mountain, Lady Tai sat silently at the table. She looked at the calm winter lake in front of her. She looked at the floating ice shards on the lake and the snowy forest on the opposite shore reflected by the ice shards. "Are you nervous?" she suddenly asked. Butler Jean noticed that the lady hadn't drunk the tea in front of her. He slowly walked up to her and replaced her cup. He didn't answer the question because he knew that the lady was asking about someone else. Secretary Shin stood behind the lady. After a moment of silence, he replied, "I am indeed a little nervous. The capital ring is so unstable and dangerous. It's really hard to imagine." Lady Tai gently pinched the slightly hot ear of the cup. She smiled and said, "That's because you're too young. Or rather, you haven't had the opportunity to come into contact with the real history outside of history textbooks. Since the end of the Republic, who knows how many situations like this have happened in the history of the Three Forests galaxy. The war between the government and the seven great families didn't just start today, and it's also impossible for it to end today in such a crude and simple way." The lady looked at the winter forest on the opposite side of the lake and said calmly, "Countless of our ancestors died tragically in military prisons. Several presidents also died in pools of blood due to assassination attempts. It wasn't until later that everyone realized that there was no benefit in continuing this war that they chose to coexist." She continued expressionlessly, "Mr. President is similar to young people like you. He's not willing to learn more about history. After all, The Lee Jae-do family's history is too short, so they can't understand that everything has a reason to exist. After saying this, Lady Tai looked at Shunli and said with a smile, as the most humiliating character in the Trinity Association, they thought that they would know my bottom line and all the trump cards of the 7 great families through you. That's why they dared to use such a crude and rude method. However, they didn't expect that through you, I would be able to see their every move clearly. I know who their supporters in the Senate are, but they don't know anything. Madam, you're very farsighted. Secretary Shin had followed Lady Tai for almost 10 years, so he didn't think that his words were flattering. He frowned and said in a low voice, but since you knew beforehand that the government would use the military, why did you insist on not leaving? The reason why these 1,000-year-old families were able to survive in the Federation is not only because they have too many resources, but also because these families have their own persistence and sense of glory. That's why I believe that no matter if it's the Li family or the Nan Xiang family, when faced with the arrest of the federal forces, they definitely wouldn't run away. At least, they would leave behind a few people with enough weight to maintain their own glory. Lady Tai smiled and said, as a descendant of the imperial family, the Tai family doesn't have the right to run away. If they were scared and ran to Bermuda, this war might have ended a few thousand years ago. But it's still too risky. Secretary Shin looked at the forest on the opposite side of the lake. Lady Tai looked at the vague silhouettes of mechas in the forest and said with a mocking smile, since you already knew that the one in charge of attacking this area was the Mecha Battalion of the 1st Regiment, then what danger is there? Or perhaps you should call the president now and ask him why this military unit hasn't attacked yet. Instead, those mechas are guarding Macho's back mountain. Secretary Shin looked in shock at the dozen or so black mechas patrolling the forest. He finally understood where his madam's calmness came from. Feiqing's military god had suppressed the 7 great families for decades, but in the end, he still hadn't completely succeeded. His right hand trembled slightly, and it was difficult for him to take out his phone. The Federation government launched its final attack on the 7 great families. Those families that had been silent for 3 whole years finally began to bare their sharp fangs. In the middle of a heated debate on Parliament Hill, a hardcore supporter of President Pobre suddenly asked to speak. This representative used the most unyielding attitude to attack the president and the government. Before the impeachment vote had even started, he passionately declared that he would definitely vote in favor of the impeachment vote. The hall was in an uproar. What happened next caused the entire Federation to be in an uproar. The Tai family's Xiao Shu Foundation and Sanlin United Bank joined forces and officially announced the full privatization of the Shell Motor Company. There was a saying in the Federation, where there is metal, there is the mark of Shell Motor Company. This company had invented the Jingnong battery and the crystal engine. It had a long history and had a close relationship with the federal military. Please don't bear the responsibility of the government that you shouldn't bear. The president frowned and asked, I really want to know why you didn't hesitate to expose thousands of years of hidden shares to take back the Nutshell Motor Company. What is your purpose? The lawyer walked out from behind and took out a few documents and spread them on the table. He said very kindly, according to the purchase contract and financial guarantee contract signed between the Shell Motor Company and the Federation government, 3 large amounts of money should have been received by now. We hope that the government can return the money immediately. The president of the Nutshell Foundation frowned even more. He was very clear about the current financial situation of the Federation government. It was already very difficult to support the Left Sky Starfield War. If it was in the past, the government could definitely delay the payment to the Nutshell Motor Company, but now, the Tai family couldn't accept it. As for the only company that could continue to provide the government with war loans, the Sanlin United Bank. It was said that their new CEO had just been arrested by the government. The president's smile became bitter, and he asked, "What if the government doesn't return the money?" The lawyer suddenly changed his expression. He was cold and ruthless like a Bermuda loan shark. He slammed the table and roared, "It is only right to return the money owed. If the government doesn't return the money, all the production bases under the Nutshell Motor Company are not allowed to give them a single warship or mecha. The 4 feather-level warships that were preparing to leave the old moon base are to return immediately. The daily maintenance of the base is to stop immediately. Also, all the mechanical engineers that the company left in the army must be recalled. Don't forget that we are the ones paying their salaries." The president's body turned cold. He thought about the terrible situation that the Federation forces would face if all of this really happened. He couldn't help but clench his fists and shout, "Are you crazy?" The lawyer wasn't crazy because he was carrying out the will of Lady Tai. Facing the attack of the government, the madam's real crazy response was yet to come. If the voting rights in the parliament and the drastic change in the Nutshell Motor Company couldn't cause the Federation government to panic because of the limitation of time, then the following thing was completely different. Behind the new moon base, in an important crystal mine area of the Ministry of Defense's General Assembly base, a violent explosion suddenly occurred. This explosion didn't cause too many casualties, but it directly turned 455 units of crystal mines into green smoke. Crystal mines were very stable energy sources. Other than the abnormal transition of electrons caused by laser irradiation, they were as safe as a pile of rocks. This sudden explosion in the new moon base was like a bolt of lightning that struck the hearts of many important people in the government and military. For the Federation forces, in the war against the Empire, crystal mines were definitely the most important strategic resource. Without crystal mines, the Federation's fleet wouldn't be able to cross the vast universe, and no matter how strong the Federation's ground mecha troops were, they would only become a pile of steel garbage that looked at the left sky star region from the capital ring. 455 units of crystal mines turned into green smoke in the explosion. This wasn't a loss that couldn't be endured, but the problem was that if this explosion was deliberately caused by some power, then it meant that the other party had the ability to paralyze the Federation fleet at any time. The cold winter wind blew into the balcony and suddenly became warm, gently blowing the hair beside the wrinkles at the corner of the madam's eyes. She took the phone from Secretary Shin, smiled slightly, and replied, "Mr. President, Macho has been controlling the Crystal Mine Consortium in the back of the mountain for too many years. From exploration, mining, purification, preservation, and transportation, there are too many steps in this process. Even I don't know how many methods there are to turn these crystal mines into useless rocks or green smoke. When did you start preparing?" The madam slowly stood up, walked to the railing, and looked at the picturesque landscape covered by the winter snow. She gently breathed, then elegantly replied, "Maybe it started on the day the Empire ended. In the period of history that you and I are in, Macho started preparing these measures in the back of the mountain, starting from a conversation on the balcony. Was that 3 or 4 years ago? At that time, Shi Qinghai killed several of your most important partners in the parliament. Su Lu returned from the West Woods to the capital ring, and you couldn't even shoot him down with your battleships. Then, General Li Jiedu came to Macho's back of the mountain and had a long talk with me. Lady Tai held the phone and said, "Mr. President, at that time, I once said something. Once the steel monsters have their own consciousness, their appetite will become extremely greedy. In their eyes, any former overlord is just a few pieces of delicious synthetic meat. My family doesn't want to become the delicious synthetic meat in your eyes, so naturally, we have to make some preparations. You should allow the synthetic meat to have the right to fight back." With a muffled sound, a large caliber bullet with a tungsten tail shot out from the thick barrel of the ACW. It tore through the sky under the shadow of the lead clouds and blasted a terrifying deep crater in front of the military vehicle on the road. The distance was too far beyond the effective range. Sulu wasn't surprised that the first shot didn't hit the target. He carried the heavy military backpack and stepped on the smooth surface of the rock with one foot in front of the other. He aimed at the military vehicle on the road at the foot of the mountain expressionlessly and pulled the trigger again. Suli's index finger quickly made contact with the trigger and then released it. The top half of the ACW kept retreating like a bolt of lightning and then bounced back. In the short span of 3 seconds, Sulu, who was standing on the rock, fired 5 consecutive shots. Bang! 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 The ground around the military vehicle at the foot of the mountain exploded almost at the same time. The rear tire of the military vehicle on the right was shot out and fell to the ground with a loud crack. Smoke and dust suddenly filled the road. As the strongest force in the Federation, the Iron 7 Division naturally had the fastest reaction speed. The moment the gunshots rang out, the 2 mechas of the defense battalion arrived with a roar. The tall and heavy bodies crushed the road and thick mechanical legs stretched out like lightning and blocked the side of the dark green military vehicle. The 7th bullet came from the depths of the mountain range at high speed and hit the alloy armor of the MX mecha's mechanical legs. It actually shot out a dazzling white mark. Still, because of the distance, the ACW bullet couldn't penetrate the Federation's mecha. On the rock, Sulu was still expressionless. After changing the magazine, he aimed at the road at the foot of the mountain and continued to fire without stopping. In order to kill Du Shaoqing from a distance in front of the entire Iron 7 Division, there would only ever be a few chances, or even just one shot. The problem was that because of the damn distance, Su Li's first shot had directly missed. Right now, he wasn't disappointed, just a little anxious. When this famous Federation general indifferently ignored the danger and fired at the mountaintop like an ordinary soldier, what did he think of Sulu? What reason did he have to continue on this faintly tragic path? Where did his cold desire to kill Sulu come from? Du Shaoqing pulled the trigger. A bullet fiercely shot into the mound under the rock, exploding into a clump of yellow earth. Sulu pulled the trigger. A bullet fiercely shot into the mechanical leg on the road, producing a crisp sound. At this moment, the 2 people on the mountaintop and the road, no matter who killed who, would be able to quickly return this suffocating world to its normal path. However, because the distance was too great, the bullets fired from the 2 thick ACW barrels made the world change color. Loud bangs rang out, but they were unable to accurately kill each other. It sounded more like 2 silent blacksmiths continuously hammering iron. However, even if they were hammering iron, the next hammer might be able to break the iron plate. In that case, no one could guarantee that the next bullet fired from the barrel would hit the other's body first. Amidst the flying shards of sharp rocks, the crisp bangs of bullets, and the dense shockwave of bullets, Sulu and Du Shaoqing coldly looked at each other from several kilometers away, unmoving like mountains. At this moment, this extremely rare exchange of long-range sniping had nothing to do with the quality and accuracy of the guns. The only thing left was luck. The 2 of them were gambling with their most valiant willpower and determination. They were gambling with each other's lives. On a mountain road 170 kilometers to the south, 2 men were silently shooting at each other from long range. In the western suburbs of the capital, on the balcony behind Macho Mountain, Lady Tai and President Pobre were still on the phone. Terminating the military supply contract and blowing up the crystal mine is using the lives of millions of innocent soldiers on the front lines to threaten the Federation. Do you not have a single bottom line? What exactly do you want to do? Lady Tai indifferently listened to the president's low and sharp reprimand. She replied, "Mr. President, keeping a promise is the most basic of morals. It is the bottom line of human interaction. The Crystal Mine Consortium and Nutshell were the conditions given to us by the entire society when we gave up the imperial power. If the Federation had kept the promise from back then, the shares of the 3,000 families would not have surfaced. If the government did not have any ideas about the Crystal Mine Consortium, the crystal mine would naturally be safe. The problem now is that you and your government have treated my family crudely. You have underestimated the Tai family and forgotten what this noble family name represents. This family has ruled humanity for tens of thousands of years, and the other 6 families were the retainers of the Tai family. Therefore, the Tai family has the responsibility and obligation to protect their existence, except for the Zhong family in the West Woods. Because the Zhong family was the first to betray the dynasty. They surrendered to the Republican forces in exchange for military power, and they have always thought that the East Woods incident was a purge planned by the Tai family and the Union Gang, but they have never reflected on it. That is because their shameless surrender made those so-called democratic sages realize that these families are not as unshakable as they thought. Mr. President, I will not make the same mistake as the ancestors of the Zhong family. I will not surrender, so I can tell you clearly that these families may be destroyed because of internal reasons, but they will definitely not fall because of external pressure. President Pobre on the other side of the phone was silent for a moment before he asked, "What exactly do you want?" "I want you to step down," Lady Tai replied concisely. "That's an impossible thing." President Pobre replied in a deep voice, "The situation has developed to this point. Even if you have a trump card that can shake the Federation, it is impossible to turn back the tide of history. I want to remind you, madam, that Tai Ziyuan has already promised to donate the Crystal Mine Consortium. The shares of Nutshell are exposed to the public. Even if you families force me to step down or even kill me, do you think that the Federation will still be controlled by the 7 families in the future? Our trump card has never been completely explained by anyone, including you." Lady Tai walked to the railing with the phone in her hand. She looked at the thin ice on the surface of the lake and said expressionlessly, "Without the Crystal Mine and Nutshell, do you think that the Tai family will not be able to survive in the Federation? I can remind you of one point, including the President's residence and Parliament Hill, these lands are all mine." She did not give the other side of the phone the time to digest the shock and said, Yuan once trusted and admired you a lot, but you do not know that under that thin body hides a magma-like fury and a terrifying learning ability. When he discovered that you had betrayed the ideals he believed in, the combination of the two was so powerful. All of the families have been silent for an entire 3 years. That is because I know that if the government and you were willing to abide by the rules, Yuan definitely has the ability to defeat you. But since the Federation government is not going to abide by the rules and tear away the cover of the law, then do not blame us old fellows for taking action. I have to admit that your trump card and strength have indeed caused the Federation to be greatly threatened. But madam, have you not thought about how the current situation will end if the government is not willing to compromise? At that time, you should be very clear about what kind of reaction the federal forces will have. Mr. President, if you start to go crazy, if Li Jiedu starts to go crazy, if most of the people in the government start to go crazy, then I will have no choice but to become a crazy woman. Lady Tai held the railing with her left hand and the phone with her right hand. She said in a deep voice, "Even if we die together, so what? Our descendants will continue to live, and you and your government will gradually be eroded in these ruins, and then become an insignificant line on the pillar of shame in history." Her voice suddenly became cold, and with an extremely rare sharp and cold tone, she said sternly, "If you dare to let Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division take one step into the capital, then we will all be destroyed together. If you want to destroy the Tai family, then you must take the Federation down with you. Mr. Pobre, from 3 years ago, I knew that you couldn't win this war, because you weren't clear-headed at all. You didn't know that you were actually fighting against the entire world alone, against a great history that you didn't know how great. On the other end of the phone, President Pobre was silent for a long time, and then his tired voice became stable and tough again. He slowly replied, "Madam, if this is your last condition, then let us and this rotten world be destroyed together." After the call ended, Lady Tai stood by the railing of the balcony, looking at the quiet lake in the forest in winter, and was silent for a long time. Secretary Shen, who was standing behind her, had a nervous expression because of the president's last sentence. "In your opinion, is Du Xiaoqing crazy?" Lady Tai suddenly asked. Secretary Shen shook his head. "Very good. Pobre has already started to regret, but let's see how long he can hold on." Lady Tai lightly touched the cold stone railing, as if she was describing the old general on the chessboard, who was full of vicissitudes of life, hiding in the soldiers, and never waking up again. Please calculate with your colleagues in the finance department when you are free. If all the people of the Federation want to buy 11% of the shares of the Nutshell Mobile, how much would it cost per person on average? Shui Yi slowly put down the heavy standard machine in his hand and looked at the thin back of the desk in the distance with a complicated expression. As a core member of the Tai family for generations, for the first time, he was shaken by the concept of the so-called family of thousands of generations. Could it be that these things were really very boring, like what the young master said? The homeland of the Federation was already in a precarious situation. Once this war really started, then no matter who won or lost, it would inevitably lead to the most tragic and terrifying ending. However, it seemed that the Creator wanted the people of the Federation to experience more tests and wanted the people of the Federation to know what was the true meaning of internal and external troubles. Therefore, more stories happened in the Zwitian galaxy, which was far away from their homeland. Your Highness, the Crown Prince is now lost in the Federation, and the young princess is also staging an uprising in the West Woods. If we launch such a large-scale attack on the Federation's war zone at this time, I am very worried that their situation will become more dangerous. The Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Military Affairs who received His Majesty's order looked at Huai Chaoshi, who was walking out of the camp in fear. His body was extremely low, and his voice was constantly trembling. It is his own choice to risk his life for those outlanders. Since that is the case, he must bear the consequences of this choice. Huai Chaoshi did not turn around. Her voice was abnormally calm. The Empire will not give up such a good opportunity in front of us just because of his life and death. The invasion force of the Federation is currently in a state of panic. Logistical support is rare and inefficient. If we lose this opportunity, have you ever thought about how many soldiers will die because of this when we want to take back planet Mo Hua and chase the invaders out of the Zwitian galaxy in the future? Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes slightly and looked at the hundreds of Empire fighter jets whistling through the sky. She looked at the densely packed Wolf Fang mechas in the wilderness. She looked at the equipped military vehicles passing through the simple roads. She looked at the ordinary soldiers of the Empire who were holding guns and silent and uneasy. She said expressionlessly, "I am an older sister, but I am first and foremost the Empire's princess. I am the highest commander of the Empire's frontline troops. I have to be responsible for these fresh faces living in front of me." After saying this, this invincible princess took off her black military cloak and threw it to Paul behind her. She then jumped onto the tall peach miasma mecha. Before Du Xiaoqing left the Zwitian galaxy, he had left her an extremely valuable gift. The Federal forces had obtained two great victories in planet Mo Hua's Straits War Zone and the Southwest War Zone. All military analysts firmly believed that the Empire's ground forces, which had suffered heavy casualties and lacked the protection of a fleet, would not be able to carry out a large-scale attack for at least 2 years. The front line should be peaceful for a long time. However, out of the Federation's and even the entire universe's judgment, on the day the Federation's parliament began to impeach the president, the Empire's military launched an unprecedentedly fierce attack on the Federation. Furthermore, the strategic attack range this time had even exceeded planet Mo and spread to several other war zones in the universe. The Empire's military, which had been lying low for several months, suddenly burst out and used the last of the Empire's fleet. The Imperial family even used ruthless means to directly conscript all the smuggled spaceships in Galaxy L. Faced with thousands of Empire's civilian armed spaceships that covered the sky and covered the Earth and were not afraid of death, the Federal fleet, which was hovering on one side of the Zwitian galaxy, watched as their energy supply rapidly decreased. However, they did not obtain an overwhelming advantage. They could only passively leave the main war zones and watch as the ground forces fell into a fierce battle with the Empire's army. The Empire's ground forces fiercely pushed forward on several planets. Their commanders did not seem to care at all whether it was soldiers or mud that fell under the Federation mecha, nor did they care whether there were still allies in the area covered by the bombardment of the cluster formation bases. They only cared about advancing, advancing, and advancing. The battle on planet Mo was the most intense. The surface forces led by the three Empires' Royal Mecha Brigades successfully drove the Federal forces out of the Straits War Zone and the Southwest War Zone after paying a heavy price of 400 Wolf Fang Mecha being destroyed. Faced with this kind of almost berserk method of advancement, the Federation's Lieutenant General Hu Lian, who was known for his iron chain defense, was bitterly disappointed before the battle even started. Meanwhile, the Empire's commander Huai Chaoshi made a few extremely small mistakes in the Federation's command, and all of them were caught by the Empire's commander-in-chief, Huai Chaoshi, and then dealt the most accurate and fatal blow. The Federation's ground forces on planet Mo were forced to retreat under the powerful attacks of the Empire's army. In the few war zones that were separated, some of the troops were even forced to move to the dangerous mountainous areas and began a bleak long-term campaign. Behind them, almost 10 mechas followed. At this time, Sulu had already charged about 300 meters into the valley like a flash of lightning. He suddenly stopped running at high speed. His military boots dug deep into the mud to dissolve the huge inertia. His body twisted under the support of terrifying strength and pulled the triggers at the three black mechas behind him. Paw! Paw! Not conforming to the norms of any military tactics manual, and beyond the imagination of the strongest warrior, Sulu, who was being chased by the mechas, actually had the time to turn around and fire 2 shots at lightning speed. This was why after leaving the cliff, he would rather sacrifice running speed to maintain the posture of holding his pistols with both hands. It was because he needed to ensure the speed of his shots. At such a close distance, the Federation's Gun King, ACW, definitely had the ability to shoot through the sturdy alloy plates of the mechas. The 3 black MX mechas behind him obviously knew this. At this time, these excellent pilots of the Iron 7th Division also displayed their excellent control skills. None of the 3 black mechas made any movement to slow down or evade. Instead, they suddenly crossed their fists in front of their chests and used their thick mechanical arms to protect the cockpit. The 2 armor-piercing bullets that Sulu had been preparing for a long time hit the mechanical arm of the black mecha at the front. 2 sparks flashed, and the black mecha's mechanical arm emitted green smoke. However, the mecha itself did not suffer any damage. Its speed did not even decrease in the slightest. The black mecha crossed its fists in front of its chest. Its movement seemed clumsy and even a little comical, but it was actually very effective against the terrifying ACW. This was the most powerful tactic of the Iron 7th Division. Sulu was still running with his head down. The 3 Iron 7th Division mechas were still in pursuit. In just a few seconds, they had covered hundreds of meters again. However, no matter how strong the human body was, it could not compare to the energy of the quantum beam jet of the twin engines. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. Just as it seemed that he was about to enter a desperate situation, Sulu burst out again. However, this time, he did not use the powerful strength of his legs to stop his forward momentum. Instead, he stomped on the ground with his military boots. His entire body flew up, and he completed a twisting motion in midair. He flew smoothly backwards like a bird in the winter valley, his body balance perfectly maintained. He leveled his ACW and looked expressionlessly at the nearest Iron 7th Division mecha. Paw! 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 3 shots. The 3 bullets avoided the clumsy mechanical arm of the Iron 7th Division mecha in front of the cockpit. They seemed to be unintentional, but in fact, they accurately hit the hidden guard behind the mecha's shoulder blade. In the minds of most Federation pilots, the hidden guard with 6 screws was like the cecum of a human's abdomen. It was completely useless. However, in the eyes of a certain person who designed MX, the hidden guard was like the skull of a human head. Below it were densely packed data cables. Once they were opened in his hands, he would be able to directly control the mecha. "I'll kill you in 3 shots. Look at that perfect angle, that precise wedging force." Sulu muttered to himself as he breathed heavily. He ran up the steep hill. From the corner of his eyes, he glanced behind him from time to time. He found that the 10 or so Iron 7th Division mechas behind him had not yet closed in. Because of the terrain, the 3 black MX mechas at the front were gradually pulling away from him. The black MX that he had hit 5 times in a row was the closest to him. It was also the most aggressive. However, in Suli's eyes, this black MX was like a delicious piece of cake. He held his ACW and breathed rapidly, silently chanting in his mind. "Closer. A little closer. Those behind, slow down a little." It was truly a pipe dream for him to think that he could defeat Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Masters with just 1 person or 7 teams to fight against the federal government. However, for him, if he had a powerful mecha, perhaps the situation would be fundamentally changed. After the battle 3 years ago, the Federation government began to strictly control the use of military mechas. They were protected by multiple layers of passwords. When they were not activated, even Sulu would not be able to successfully steal them. Today's scene was the result of Suli's calculations. He knew that the mecha group of Iron 7th Division would definitely catch up, and this would be the best chance for him to steal the mecha. Stealing a military mecha with his bare hands. In the eyes of many people, this was akin to a myth. No one would believe it, but Sulu had seen Uncle Feng Yu go crazy before. In fact, he had even played out a similar scene on Mo Hua Planet. Today, Sulu did not have an engineering mecha, nor did he have a miniature repair arm. However, he had his ACW. Seemingly unintentionally, he had been shooting at the hidden guard all this time. His goal was to force the guard open and then find a chance to flip over and use the data under the guard to directly take control of the Black MX. Once he got his hands on the mecha, it would be Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division's turn to fret. Du Shaoqing watched as the blurry figure disappeared over the side of the cliff. He watched as the 10 or so mecha chased after it. Expressionlessly, he took back his ACW and handed it to the officer beside him. Then, he picked up his sunglasses and gently blew off the dust on the lenses before putting them on and walking towards the military vehicle. Suddenly, his sword-like eyebrows shot up. He abruptly turned around to look at the rocky peak that was now nowhere to be seen. He remembered the battle report Li Feng had sent back from Mo Hua Planet a few days ago, and remembered the MX mecha that Sulu had successfully captured. His raised eyebrows suddenly sank. Du Shaoqing said in a low voice, "Withdraw all mecha." Including Division Commander Lu Yongfu and all the staff officers, no one understood why the division's mecha had to withdraw just as they were about to catch up and eliminate that damned sniper. However, the discipline of the Iron 7th Division was as strict as a mountain. Facing this division commander Shaoqing, who was no longer a division commander, everyone was used to following orders without questioning or questioning. The order for the mecha group to withdraw immediately reached the mountain valley in the shortest amount of time possible. Du Shaoqing stared silently in the direction of the deep mountain valley through his sunglasses, and then ordered, "Troops continue forward. Target is the 1st Unified Special District." The surrounding Iron 7th Division officers were slightly taken aback. Then, some of them understood Division Commander Shaoqing's meaning. As long as the troops did not disperse and use several mecha to seal off the shooting angles in the direction of the mountain range, what could the sniper in the mountain do? The other party could only watch as this flood of steel silently and unstoppably entered the capital special district. There was nothing they could do. This was Du Shaoqing. This was the Iron 7th Division. This division and its core figure sometimes looked a little too mechanical and cold, but they yearned for victory but were not greedy for it. Their eyes were clear, their steps firm. They may not be the strongest division, but they were definitely the division that made the least number of mistakes. Du Shaoqing sat back in the car with an expressionless face. He didn't look at the handcuffed officer beside him. This was like an excellent boxer who did not hesitate to hold his head and take a beating passively, getting beaten until his nose was bruised and his face was swollen and bleeding profusely, pretending to be weak and stalling for time until he finally found the moment to land the fatal blow. He viciously threw out the right heavy punch that he had hidden for 11 rounds, only to suddenly realize that the punch was aimed at empty air. Su Lu, whose face was covered in blood and stains, stared blankly at the two trees. He watched as the dozen or so Iron 7 Division mecha retreated into the wilderness at the bottom of the mountain range. He stood there like that pitiful boxer, dumbly standing in place. He ran back to the cliff near the mountain range and looked down at the steel troops that had already finished organizing and were neatly marching towards the capital. He couldn't help but frown deeply. The Iron 7 Division had dealt with his thousands of changes by remaining motionless. The difference in strength was too great, so this was destined to be the most conservative and least wrong way of dealing with him. Facing the terrifying steel torrent at the bottom of the mountain range, what else could he do other than engage in meaningless harassment along the way? More than 100 black MX mechas were spread out in the wilderness. 7 of them were closely following the dark green military vehicle on the road, closely covering any long-range sniping range from any angle. Hundreds of armored vehicles followed behind, and the army of more than 10,000 people maintained a perfect formation as they slowly advanced in the direction of the capital. Other than the roar of the engines, there was no other sound to be heard, giving people a silent, oppressive, austere, and unstoppable feeling. Su Lu suppressed his rapid breathing and stroked the hot body of the ACW. He looked down at the silent Iron 7 Division under his feet and couldn't help but feel a strong sense of defeat. Right now, there was no force around the capital that could be a match for Du Shaoqing's Iron 7 Division. Once this army entered the capital, what would the people who were also known as the Silent Marching Army face? Along the way, a certain someone tried his best to snipe, but he was still as powerless as the mosquitoes flying around the bison on the other side of the Donglin electronic fence. The bison that silently ate grass didn't care about the bullets in the air at all. It only occasionally swung its tail to hit them, and a certain someone had to retreat into the mountain range at high speed like a mosquito fleeing for its life. It seemed that there was no force that could stop the Iron 7 Division from entering the capital. However, at this moment, the silent steel torrent suddenly stopped outside an inconspicuous town. It wasn't Iron 7 Division that stopped the advance of the Iron 7 Division, nor was it Black Hawk Security Company, nor was it the Zhong family troops from the West Woods who suddenly learned how to travel through space, nor was it the Imperial armies who madly followed the Crown Prince. It was just a man covered in dirt and bleeding wounds like a beggar. No beggar, not even the beggar gang leader in Schiller's 8, could slow down the pace of the Iron 7 Division at all. However, this beggar was Dong Fangyu, the former commander of the Iron 7 Division. Many of the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7 Division in the armored vehicles in front of him were personally selected by him and promoted to be his subordinates. Dong Fangyu, who was holding a pair of crutches, looked at the armored vehicle that slowly stopped in front of him. An abnormal flush of excitement appeared on his face. He supported himself with his crutches and struggled to move forward. The wounds on his body that were left a few days ago were now bleeding. The current commander of the Iron 7 Division, Liu Yongfu, who had received the news, quickly rushed to the front of the troop. Looking at Dong Fangyu, who looked like a miserable beggar, his pupils shrank. He reached out to help him and then take him away. Unexpectedly, Dong Fangyu pushed him away and shouted in a deep voice, "Get lost." As the most senior officer of the Iron 7 Division, as one of the first subordinates to follow Du Shaoqing, as one of the arms who was as famous as Shimin Jin, in Dong Fangyu's eyes, no one in the Iron 7 Division was qualified to talk to him, except for his real commander, Du Shaoqing. When she arrived in front of the dark green military vehicle, Dong Fangyu struggled free from the support of the two majors. She threw away her crutches and limped forward quickly. She shouted at Du Shaoqing, who was standing beside the vehicle, "Commander, you can't go. You can't ruin your reputation for those shameless politicians. You've been wronged." Du Shaoqing looked at Dong Fangyu, who was crying like a wronged child. Looking at this man who had been following him for more than a decade, he rubbed his head and gently explained, "I know what happened on the Inkflower planet. That was caused by that trash Hu Lian, but I can assure you that Mr. President didn't know about it beforehand." Dong Fangyu wiped the tears on his face with his sour sleeve. Hearing his commander's explanation, he couldn't help but angrily take 2 steps back and shouted, "The president didn't know? Then what about the ancient bell? That was done by Shimin Jin, how could the president not know? Commander, could it be that Shimin Jin is dead, so we can just let him be the scapegoat for that black-faced president?" Du Shaoqing's face suddenly stiffened, and he shouted in a deep voice, "Enough. Not enough." Dong Fangyu's temper had always been sour and irritable, otherwise, he wouldn't have caused such a big mess with the Iron 7th Division. Among the oldest officers of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing was famous for being good at guessing Du Shaoqing's intentions, and he was famous for being the only one who dared to debate with Du Shaoqing. "Commander, that day when you volunteered to become the commander of the independent battalion in the 7th Division, you told me and Shimin that since you were born in the Iron 7th Division, you can't die so casually." "Commander, I'm not dead. Commander, I went to NTR for 4 whole years, and I didn't look like a human, nor a ghost, but I didn't want to commit suicide, and I endured it. Why? Because I didn't want to lose face for the Iron 7th Division." Dong Fangyu stared at Du Shaoqing with bloodshot eyes, raised his chin proudly, and said loudly, "That's why I didn't want my most respected commander Du Shaoqing to do something that would lose face for the entire Iron 7th Division. Unless Commander doesn't recognize me as a soldier of the Iron 7th Division, then let the mecha run over me." Du Shaoqing looked at him silently, his chest rising and falling slightly under his dark green military uniform. Suddenly, he raised his arm and chopped at the left side of Dong Fangyu's neck, and then he didn't look at the unconscious person in the arms of the other officers, and directly turned to walk towards the military vehicle, shouting just before he boarded, "Medic! Here! Keep him alive!" Yes. Sitting in the front passenger seat of the military vehicle, Du Xiaoqing glanced at Zhou Yu's face from the corner of his eye. Zhou Yu was clearly expressionless at this time, but Du Xiaoqing somehow felt that he saw a faint trace of mockery. Dong Fangyu was once the commander of the 1st Division, and Zhou Yu was the current commander of the 2nd Division. These two soldiers, both with the word Yu in their names, were once his most trusted subordinates, but today, Du Xiaoqing suddenly felt inexplicably anxious, and his body was a little hot. His straight eyebrows slowly furrowed, and he subconsciously undid the 3rd button of his well-ironed uniform. Perhaps it was fate's arrangement, but on this day, the Iron 7th Division's march towards the capital seemed to be unstoppable, but on the road, they were constantly forced to stop moving forward. After the troops entered the suburbs of Wangdu, they stopped again. All the mecha, vehicles, and soldiers vigilantly watched their surroundings, guarding against attacks that could come at any time. This time, they were forced to stop moving forward because there was a serious traffic jam on Highway 2 from Wangdu to the capital. The military MX mecha could naturally continue to advance at high speed through the fields, but the hundreds of armored vehicles and military vehicles could not do so. If they wanted to enter the capital to control the situation and maintain order, it was far from enough to rely solely on the heavy, lethal mecha. The hundreds of armored vehicles and military vehicles of the Iron 7th Division did not enter Highway 2. The troops were waiting for the engineering mecha to open up the communication and auxiliary roads, and then enter the military passage. This was a situation that had been planned, so Du Xiaoqing was not anxious at this time. He looked at the traffic jam outside the window, and his long frown slowly relaxed. Outside the window, there was a crowded crowd and traffic. Countless civilian cars, accompanied by cheerful honks, rushed into Highway 2, and then drove towards the city in the distance. The shadows of more than 100 military mecha covered both sides of the road, and the hundreds of armored vehicles silently formed a long line. The sudden arrival of the federal forces brought great shock to the citizens of Wangdu. There were small car accidents, and more civilian vehicles subconsciously made a detour. The crowd also quickly dispersed, and countless pairs of eyes fell on the armored vehicles and mecha warily. I think that I understand you very well. I always thought that you were a model professional soldier. You were just doing your duty as a Federation soldier and following the orders of the Federation President and the government. But I have to remind you that what you are doing now has crossed that boundary. Stop, Du Xiaoqing. Even if you are still pretentious and want to be buried with Pabre, his government, and their ideals, even if you insist on being a professional soldier, why can't you wait a little longer? Just wait for a short period of time until the impeachment case is over. If the impeachment case is passed, Pabre will no longer be the Federation president. You don't need to follow his orders. If the impeachment case is not passed, he will still be the Federation president. Then, what is the need for you and your troops to make the situation more complicated? If you insist, then it proves that you are afraid. You are afraid that Mr. Pabre, whom you have followed for so many years, has been abandoned by the people. You can't stand firm anymore. Du Xiaoqing, why are you so silent? Because I have torn off your glorious mask of a professional soldier and let you see that the premise of this order is that Pabre is no longer the Federation president. Accepting an order that is not from the president or not needing to accept an order from the president or waiting is a good choice. This is not the paradox of twins in physics. This is a clear fact. After being silent for a long time, Du Xiaoqing finally calmly replied, "It has already been many years. I know how that tiger looked at me back then. I know how many people in the Federation look at me. They all think that I am an idealist who is calm on the outside but fanatical on the inside. In reality, they are both wrong and right. Unlike the other people in the Trinity Association, I have never had the dream of overthrowing the 7 great families. The entire purpose of my life is to make the Federation strong and completely defeat the Empire. I am not interested in anything else. I don't care if the 7 great families controlled the Federation or if a grassroots president rules the Federation. I only care about whose Federation can be strong enough to completely defeat the Empire. You and I both know that rotten meat like the 7 great families and politicians like the former president cannot do this. Only Mr. Pobre can destroy the 7 great families and then make the Federation truly strong. After being silent for a period of time, Su Li's voice sounded again. Du Shaoqing, if the entire purpose of your life is to defeat the Empire, then you should know even more clearly that in this current situation, if you insist on standing on President Pobre's side, the Federation will inevitably fall into civil war. Your life's ideals may only turn into bubbles. Hearing the hoarse voice from the communication system, Du Shaoqing was expressionless. He slowly undid the 4th button of his military uniform, the veins on the back of his right hand appearing and disappearing. The military uniform was always well ironed, the military boots were always shiny, the black kid gloves, the black sunglasses, the neatly combed hair, and the impeccable military posture were the only images this Federation general and national idol left behind. However, at this very moment, the front of his hair was a bit messy and his well-ironed military uniform was undone. He was far from that perfect image of a general. Su Lo, I used to think that I understood you very well, but after this day, I still have a question that I haven't found the answer to. Why did you, a citizen of the Empire, come to the Federation to do these things? Why did you use the result of the Federation defeating the Empire to tempt me? You may not know, but Hui Chaoshi has already started a counterattack on planet Mo Hua while the Federation is in civil war. If you are like her, trying to take advantage of the Federation's chaos to gain benefits for the Empire, then you should be very happy to see this scene. Just as you said, the West Woods will declare independence, but the Federation will fall into civil war. Why? Because this is not a war between 2 countries to begin with. Su Li's voice was emotionless as he replied in a deep voice, there may not be such things as justice in a war between countries, but at other times, there may be. Du Shaoqing said with slight sarcasm, the youth of the Empire wants to talk about justice again. I admit that to me, this matter should be more of a personal vendetta. My ultimate goal is very simple. I just want Pobre and those people to be judged. However, whether this result can be realized or not is justice for those who have already died, even if it is overdue justice. There is no justice in a national war, no heroes in civil war. In the dark green military vehicle, Du Shaoqing looked at the flower he was fiddling with and was silent for a very long time. Then, the corners of his lips curled up slightly as he said in a sarcastic tone, if you want me to stop, then beg me. After a moment of silence in the communication system, Su Li's unprecedentedly serious and sincere voice rang out. Commander Shaoqing, I beg you. Passing through the metal bridge temporarily built by the huge engineering mecha, hundreds of armored vehicles were parked silently at the entrance to the military tunnel in the suburbs of Wangdu. More than 100 black MX mecha were spread out in the wilderness beside the tunnel, vigilantly observing the surrounding movements, ready to launch suppressive fire at any moment. Su Lo, who was being closely guarded by the Iron 7th Division, did not feel too proud at this time. Through the ACW's aiming equipment, he watched as the well-ironed general in his military uniform walked into the armed helicopter under heavy protection. After saying this, his body seemed to become unusually heavy. His tired hands holding the edge of the table could no longer bear it. His broad back trembled slightly, like a mountain that was about to collapse. His wife refused to come down from the bedroom upstairs. His daughter had not eaten at the same table as him in the bedroom upstairs for 3 years. Outside the window of the official residence, the slogans of the silent marching crowd could be faintly heard. These people used to be his staunchest supporters 3 years ago. Countless staff members were still nervously busy inside and outside the official residence. Hundreds of special task force agents were dutifully guarding their posts. Supporters were still by the railings outside the lawn. Du Xiaoqing was behind him. However, President Pobre's figure seemed particularly lonely, as if he was alone. Mr. President, I think that there is a problem with the emergency plan from Chairman Li Jiedu. At the same time, I insist that he is not a real soldier, nor is he a simple politician. He is a strange deformed child. If the Federation continues to follow his plan, it will be very dangerous. Du Xiaoqing looked at the back of the president with mixed feelings and guilt. President Pobre put his hands on the table and was silent for a long time. Then, as if he had sensed something, he subconsciously raised his head and looked at the people who supported him outside the lawn. He saw the angry middle-aged men who were ready to stop the silent march in tears. He saw the young students who cheered for the arrival of the armed fighters of the Iron 7th Division. It was as if he saw himself passionately distributing leaflets and protesting loudly in the streets. His mind buzzed like thunder. Nowhere, my dish, I like it. Chapter 975. The Oval Office was silent for a long time. President Pobre held the edge of the table and looked out the window at the people in the wind and snow with a complicated expression. He suddenly asked, "Why?" Du Xiaoqing, who was standing behind him, was silent for a moment before replying, "The NTR officer of the new 17th Division that the government is hunting down these days was once my subordinate." President Pobre furrowed his brows. A heavy self-deprecating expression appeared on his tanned face. He said, "Sorry." "No need," Du Xiaoqing replied. Indeed, there was no need to apologize. The expression on the face of this famous Federation general had already returned to calmness. He had taken the Razor Company of the Iron 7th Division and parachuted into the official residence in an armed helicopter, but he had left all of the main forces, the more than 100 military mechas and hundreds of armored vehicles, in Huangdu. This had already made his attitude and his choice clear. This choice was the heaviest blow to President Pobre. Perhaps your choice was correct. Actually, after making that call, I began to regret it. President Pobre looked out the window silently. His thick lips moved slightly. He said calmly, "The decision to mobilize the troops was indeed a bit too hasty and impulsive. There are still many Federation citizens who support me. Why would I not have the confidence to wait for the results of the impeachment case?" "Mr. President, I think so too," Du Xiaoqing replied. "I've always thought that a firm will is my greatest strength, but I have to admit, the position of the Federation President does indeed have some kind of magic. It can make people forget what you were like in the beginning, forget that you were once a young lawyer protesting on the streets, forget what you hated the most back then. Even now, I still believe that my actions were not wrong, including mobilizing the troops. It's just that I began to feel a strong disgust towards certain changes. My disgust lies in." Pobre turned around and looked at Du Xiaoqing. He sighed softly and said emotionally, "Every morning when I wake up and look in the mirror, I realize that I've finally become the kind of person I despise and fear." Right at this moment, the heavy door of the Oval Office was quickly pushed open from the outside. Office Director Breen, who was forcing himself to appear calm, hurried in. He glanced at the electronic document in his hand and asked with great difficulty, "Mr. President, are you going to defend yourself on Parliament Hill?" "Why not?" President Pobre took down his dark windbreaker from the hanger and looked at the bedroom upstairs through the ceiling. Then he looked at Du Xiaoqing and said with a smile, "Xiaoqing, take your soldiers and come with me." Du Xiaoqing saluted. President Pobre put on his windbreaker and walked out of the door. His expression was firm and calm, as if he was still the young lawyer who had walked into the Supreme Court for the first time. Back then, the young and poor lawyer did not have the confidence to win the public service lawsuit against a certain giant enterprise, but he was very confident. Rapid footsteps were heard as President Pobre walked down the stairs under the protection of the Special Task Force agents and a certain razor-sharp company of the Iron 7th Division. He followed the secret passage under the official residence to the exit behind the Ministry of Finance building in Charter Square. A convoy had been waiting there for a long time. Underneath the official residence was the Federation Government Processing Center, which occupied a large area. Countless daily affairs in the Sandland sector were completed here, and the work of contacting countless departments was then handed over to the president for signature. The soft light was like the most gentle sun, shining in the vast underground space. But personally, no matter the result of the impeachment case, I think that you have made a lot of good efforts and have done very well. I promise you that if the impeachment case fails and someone tries to do something outside the framework of the charter, the federal forces and I will make sure that you and the government will be fully implemented. President Pobre smiled and reached out to pat him on the shoulder. On the solemn rostrum of the Parliament Hill, Pobre looked calmly at the packed seats in front of him. His expression was calm, and his voice was still deep and powerful. However, today he was not delivering the annual State of the Union address. Instead, he was defending himself as the impeached president. This defense was very simple, and it might even be the shortest speech he had ever given in his life. There was no emotional refutation in this defense, no sharp loopholes to catch, and it seemed that he did not even bother to provide evidence. You sitting in the seats now, and the people behind you, no one has the right and position to judge me, the President of the Federation. Only history has the right to judge me. President Pobre leaned forward slightly and slowly swept his gaze over the embarrassed members of the Parliament. He said calmly, "But no matter how history pronounces it, I still insist that I am innocent." The deep and firm voice echoed in the empty Parliament Hill, and then there was a deathly silence. Looking at the dark-faced middle-aged man on the rostrum who did not have much elegance or nobility, the excited members of the Pobre faction could not help but stand up and return the warmest applause. This was the poorest president in the history of the Federation. A poor lawyer who came from a mining family in Donglin had finally ascended to the throne of power in the Federation. Looking at the face they had loathed for 7 years and thinking of the fierce battles in front of and behind the scenes, even the opposition members of the Parliament could not help but feel endless emotions in their hearts. They subconsciously began to softly clap. After the defense ended, the Parliament Hill entered the most crucial voting session. President Pobre and his government officials left the hall and went to the conference room to wait for the final result. According to the calculations of the subordinate organization of the official residence, there should be at least 40% of the Parliament Hill members who could not lose their votes. However, before the final result of the voting was out, no one dared to say that they would definitely win. The old man on the rostrum of Parliament Hill smiled and nodded to the even older chief judge who seemed to have fallen asleep beside him. After clearing his throat, he said, "Everyone, the vote for the impeachment bill against President Pobre has officially begun. Before the vote, I want to say a few words. Although we all like money and power, for the sake of the Federation, for the sake of the little sense of responsibility that you may have, when you answer yes or no, please try to only ask your own rationality and emotions." Everyone knew that Deputy Speaker Sheehan was the closest political partner of Lady Tai in the back mountain of Macho. It was natural for him to make such a statement before the impeachment vote. However, when the vote began, many people were shocked. Senator Sun Yeyu, do you think President Pobre is guilty of the first charge? Yes. Senator Scree, do you think President Pobre is guilty of the second charge? Yes. No. Yes. No. The impeachment vote was going on anxiously and nervously. As several members unexpectedly voted in favor of the impeachment, the hall began to be filled with a strange and depressing atmosphere. The members who did not understand what was going on whispered to each other with extremely complicated expressions. In this war, the opponents of the seven great families were more determined, patient, and powerful. Although the impeachment bill was about to be passed in Parliament Mountain, there were still countless Federation soldiers loyal to him. There were also countless important members of the seven great families locked up in prison. Du Shaoqing was standing behind the president. Therefore, the young Federation councillor, the successor of the leader of the seven great families, the Tai family, became the most suitable and most sincere negotiation target. Under the escort of the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, Tai Xuan slowly walked over from the other side of the wind and snow. His thin body looked like it could collapse at any time. He took out a white silk handkerchief and gently covered his mouth. He walked into the tavern and calmly sat in front of President Pobre. He said tiredly, "Mr. President, I hope you can calmly accept the result of the Parliament's vote." Pobre quietly looked at the young councillor in front of him. After a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth. He didn't answer the question, but seriously praised, "As an old civil servant, I know very well that the assembly movement may seem very simple, but in fact, it is very difficult to do it well. And you did very well. It is my honor to be praised by you in this aspect." Tai Xuan put down the handkerchief and replied with a smile, "I have read your book." Then back to the original question. After a moment of silence, President Pobre slowly raised his eyebrows and repeated, "You want me to accept the result of the Parliament's vote and quietly leave the official residence?" "Yes." President Pobre sighed with emotion, "If I simply leave like this, the Federation will once again return to the hands of corrupt families and greedy politicians. Wouldn't that be the most boring repetition? Then what have I done in my life? What has the Federation changed because of this?" Hearing this voice, the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division on the street were shocked. They could not imagine how someone could hide from the team's scanning equipment and get so close to the tavern. They quickly raised their guns and aimed in the direction of the voice. It was the modeled wall of the first military academy. There were traces of time and snow on it. Suddenly, a person jumped off the wall with a whoosh and swept away the remaining snow on the wall with the cold wind. That person moved so quickly that the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division did not have time to aim and fire. They only heard a series of gunshots coming from both sides of the street, especially from the west gate of Capital University. More than 10 men in advanced infantry equipment rushed over with modified sniper rifles. "Don't move. Don't move. Don't you fucking move. 7th Division bastards, don't move. Cannon. You fucking cannon of the 17th Division. Put down your guns, you son of a bitch." The members of Team 7 snuck into Capital University through the underground sewers and then used feints to attract the attention of the Special Task Force on the perimeter. They quietly approached their destination. They were already panting and exhausted from running all the way, but they still believed that they could take control of the situation immediately. However, when they found that they were facing an old acquaintance, an old enemy, an old rival, the razor-sharp company from the Iron 7th Division, they knew that taking control of the situation had become a luxury. Xiong Linquan pointed the barrel of his gun at the officer in front of him who was only a lieutenant colonel and roared, "If you dare move, I'll blow you up. You can fucking try." The commander of the razor-sharp company of the Iron 7th Division roared back. Just like how Team 7 felt at the moment, when the commander realized that these people were all from Team 7, he became more cautious than usual, even though there were many of them on his side. These two groups of soldiers had clashed many times in the open and in the dark during maneuvers and on the battlefield. They both knew how powerful each other was, so no one dared to act rashly. In such a tense situation, only the small-eyed man who had jumped down from the wall dared to move. Wearing a tattered sports coat and carrying a heavy military backpack, Sulu walked silently from the wall to the tavern across the street in the wind and snow, just like he did every time he was in battle. The only difference was that he wore a pair of glasses on the bridge of his nose. When he jumped down, Du Shaoqing, with his sharp eyes, immediately noticed this. He clasped his sunglasses tightly with his right hand behind his back and quickly gave the order to not shoot. The pair of military boots that had run 170 kilometers in the mountains squeaked as they stepped on the thin layer of snow. There was a large hole in the front of the boots, as if they were mocking someone. Sulu, whose face was covered in blood and dirt, ignored the black muzzles around him. He pulled out a pistol from his waist and loaded it with a click. He walked to the tavern across the street with an expressionless face. Xiong Linquan and a dozen other team members also approached from both ends of the street. They aimed their TP rifles at the nearby soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, completely ignoring the wounds on their bodies and the blood dripping into the white snow. When he walked past Du Shaoqing, who was standing at the entrance of the tavern, Sulu paused and looked at him. He reached out his left hand to push his glasses up the bridge of his nose and said, "Thank you." Du Shaoqing gripped his sunglasses tightly with his right hand and looked at him expressionlessly. Naturally, he wouldn't say nonsense like, "You don't need to be so polite." He coldly asked, "Are these the glasses that Shi Qinghai used?" Sulu replied, "Not those, but they're better than the ones he used. I know your gun is still in the case, so you weren't as fast as me." Du Shaoqing frowned slightly. He remembered 3 or 4 years ago, when Vice President Byron was blasted into a bloody flower by ACW under the long stone steps of the Parliament Hill. He remembered that the sunlight in Charter Square was quite good that day. He remembered that he smoked a thick cigarette on a couple's chair in the square and watched the handsome smoking young man under the statue of the Group of 5 die as if he was asleep. So he finally confirmed why Sulu came at this time, and why he dared to come. 2011. 5:13. 13:38. Modified version. Chapter 976. Hiding behind a beautiful velvet curtain and making some shady deals and compromises behind the backs of the entire audience. This is probably the legendary insider trading. The people involved in insider trading know very well that their faces are indeed very ugly at that time, so they have to hide in dark corners, such as in this tavern, whispering to each other like thieves so that no one can hear them, right? But it's really a pity that my hearing is too sharp. Even if there is a thick curtain, even if there is a street between us, I can still hear it so clearly. The loaded military pistol was tightly gripped in his hand, and the heavy military backpack was heavily carried on his shoulders. As he swayed with his footsteps, it hit his back and collided with the bulletproof hard pottery shards in his tattered sports windbreaker, making a clear and crisp sound. After so many things have happened and so many evil deeds have been done, you can just drink a few glasses of wine and chat casually, hand over the position to the other party, and then retire with a smile. With a small manor with nice scenery, you can continue to write a few diary entries to summarize your gains and losses, and then die of old age in bed with a clear conscience. Sulu stopped and looked at the two familiar faces by the table. He looked at the current president of the Federation and the young senator who was most likely to become the next president of the Federation and said, "Although this universe has never been reasonable, your idea is too unreasonable. Politics is not about reason. Tai Yuan raised his head and looked at Su Li's side face tiredly. He frowned slightly and said, "Most of the time, politics is actually all kinds of compromises." Compromises? You should know very well that I have never known how to write those two words. When the Federation wanted to compromise with Medellin, my answer was very simple. And I remember that at that time, Mr. President, you were also unwilling to accept the word compromise. Looking at President Pobre, Su Li said, "I remember that in the Nebula Award speech at the George Carlin Art Center, you once said that you have to pay the price for making a mistake, even if you are already dead. You also said that you are a devoted follower of the Federation's law, and if you are dead, people can dig up your grave and see what color it is inside." The tavern was silent for a moment, and then he suddenly heard his voice become sharp and cold. He asked coldly, "Dig up your grave? You haven't even laid in your grave yet, how am I supposed to dig you up?" The simple words were filled with extreme anger and hatred. Su Li used these words to announce to everyone present that President Pobre would never be able to retire gracefully in front of him. In order to see the color of his grave, he would not hesitate to send him to his grave. Tai Yuan frowned again. Looking at the man whom he had not seen for almost 4 years, and thinking about what kind of uncontrollable variables his sudden appearance might bring to the situation of the Federation, his face gradually became grave and solemn. He scolded in a deep voice, "Su Li, stop talking." Su Li turned to look at him and shouted rudely, "Tai Yuan, shut up." In the car at the end of the street outside the tavern, Lin Banshan heard the fierce argument coming from the tavern in the distance. After confirming that it was Su Li and his group 7, he couldn't help but shake his head. A moment later, President Pabel's deep voice broke the silence in the tavern. He quietly looked at Su Li, who was sitting beside the table. He looked at that cold and resolute expression that he once admired but now made him feel extremely dangerous. Tai Yuan looked at him and reprimanded in a deep voice, "If you are allowed to continue like this, just to satisfy your pitiful and inferior mental world, and the Federation really falls into a civil war crisis, how many people will die in the chaos? If the people can understand the insider trading you are talking about, I believe that the entire Federation will agree to this compromise. Su Li, please do not forget your identity. You are a prince of the empire." Hearing the reprimand of his best friend whom he had not seen for many years, Su Li's mood was a bit strange. His eyebrows that were as thick as ink sabers gradually rose, and the smile on his face was a bit bitter. Licking his dry and bleeding lips, he suddenly smiled and said with narrowed eyes, "Yes, for a prince of the empire to meddle in the affairs of the Federation, it really is like meddling in other people's business." His voice suddenly became extremely cold and calm. "But you should know very well that meddling in other people's business is the most important hobby of my life. This hobby has been maintained for too many years and can no longer be changed. If it were not for my meddling in other people's business back then, you would have already died in the parking lot. And don't forget that the entire West Woods will listen to what I, a citizen of the Empire, say. So no matter what agreement you reach, as long as I do not express my opinion, it will be meaningless." The West Woods was in a tense state of military confrontation. Everyone knew what kind of influence Su Li, a prince of the empire, had on the little princess of the Zhong family. If he insisted on doing something, it was believed that Zhong Huiyan would definitely lead the troops of the West Woods to follow closely behind. There was a dead silence around the wine table. Just now I was hiding behind the wall of a courtyard. I did not think about coming out, but I really did not expect that things would develop into this situation. Su Li looked at Tai Yuan, then looked at Du Shaoqing who was behind President Pobre. His thick eyebrows that were raised like sabers gradually calmed down, and he said with a self-deprecating and slightly sad smile, "Compromise, compromise, always compromise. Compromise, compromise, everyone is compromising, and I am the only citizen of the empire who refuses to compromise." This is indeed ridiculous and absurd. What is going on? Is the world crazy, or am I crazy? There was too much sadness in his plain self-deprecating tone. Su-Lu took a deep breath, and his right hand clenched the hard handle of the pistol. The wounds on his body split open, and blood slowly oozed out. His eyes that were staring at Du Shaoqing became brighter and brighter. At the end of the story, if you still want to play the role of a national scholar and not betray your master, then I'll play with you. I'm here now. You can beat me to death, but I can guarantee that before I die, I will definitely send this shoe-polishing president to his grave. As his eyes became brighter and brighter, his voice became louder and louder. His hoarse voice resounded in the tavern, but it was not impassioned, but firm, persistent, and valiant. Not holding anyone responsible after stepping down. The dead waitress in the gymnasium will not agree. The soldiers of the West Woods on the ancient bell will not agree. The dead brothers of Group 7 will not agree. Commander Zhong and his wife will not agree, but they can no longer speak. So I will say on behalf of them, I do not agree. Even if the whole Federation agrees, I still do not agree. Even if the Federation falls into a civil war. Tai Ziyuan stared at him coldly. Su-Lu did not look at him, nor did he answer his question. He slammed the pistol that he had been holding for a long time on the small table and placed it in front of President Pabre. He said in an emotionless voice, "A civil war is indeed terrible, but other than compromise, there are actually many ways to end it all, to prevent the Federation from falling into a civil war, and to my satisfaction. Sacrifice yourself." He stared into President Pabre's eyes and said, "Mr. President, don't you often ask people to sacrifice themselves for the Federation? Didn't you tell me before that some innocent lives must be sacrificed for a great cause? According to your concept, many people in the Federation have already been sacrificed. So now that a civil war is about to break out, before the danger of separation, why can't you sacrifice yourself for the Federation? Don't say nonsense like the Federation can't do without you, and the righteous cause needs your leadership. There has never been a savior in this world, and the people don't need a savior. You are not, and neither is Tai Ziyuan. No one can be a real savior." President Pabre silently looked at the pistol with a metallic luster on the table for a long time. Then he looked up at Su-Lu and asked, "Do you want me to die so badly?" Su-Lu was silent for a moment, and then he smiled and replied, "I have always had a feeling that the young master has been lying in the grave looking at me all this time. He killed the vice president of the Federation. If I let the president of the Federation escape, he will definitely laugh at me, and I can't stand being laughed at by him. So yes, since there is no trial, your death is very important to me." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.